Get him out! It's going to blow! Ryan Walker didn't stop to think. He didn't know the man's name. He didn't know he wore the patch of the Hells Angels. He only knew a human being was lying unconscious in the middle of a Montana highway, and in 2 seconds that motorcycle would become a fireball. So he ran, straight into oncoming traffic, and what happened after that single act of courage would shake an entire town to its core. Before we continue, if stories about real courage, real sacrifice, and real justice speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you were watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story travels. The heat over Route 12 shimmered like liquid glass that afternoon, the kind of Montana summer heat that made the asphalt look like it was breathing. Ryan Walker had the windows of his old pickup rolled all the way down one arm, resting on the door, sweat soaking through the back of his gray work shirt. He was 22 years old, blonde hair darkened with dust from a 10-hour shift, hands calloused and scraped from hauling lumber since 5 that morning. He was tired in the way only a man who worked 2 jobs could be tired, bone tired, the kind of exhaustion that settled into the joints and never fully left. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about the hospital bill sitting unopened on the kitchen counter, the one he hadn't found the courage to look at yet, because he already knew the number would be worse than the last one. His father, Daniel Walker, had been a proud man once, a foreman, who could lift steel beams with his bare hands and never once complained about the cold or the height or the danger. That was before the scaffolding collapsed 3 years ago, before the surgeries, before the wheelchair that now lived permanently by the front door folded up like a monument to everything that had changed. Ryan didn't resent it. He never let himself resent it. But some nights driving home in the dark with grease still under his fingernails, he allowed himself exactly 60 seconds to feel the weight of it. Just 60 seconds before he made himself stop, because self-pity didn't pay bills and it didn't get his father to physical therapy on Tuesdays. He was 3 miles from the turnoff to his father's house when he first heard it. A horn, long and violent, cutting through the shimmer of heat like a blade. Ryan's eyes flicked to his mirror on instinct, a habit drilled into him from years of driving these back roads, where deer jumped out of nowhere and logging trucks took blind curves too fast. What he saw made his stomach drop before his brain even finished processing it. A dark green pickup truck, newer than his, swerving hard into the left lane, and beside it, pressed against it, a motorcycle. "No," Ryan said out loud to no one, his foot already easing off the gas. No, no, no. The pickup truck clipped the motorcycle's rear wheel. It happened in a heartbeat. One moment the rider was upright, leaning into a curve, like he'd taken 1,000 times before. The next moment the bike was sideways. Then it wasn't a bike anymore. It was just metal and sparks skating across the pavement, and the rider was tumbling, actually tumbling, a human body rolling across asphalt at 50 miles an hour, like a rag doll thrown from a moving car. The green pickup truck didn't slow down. It sped up. Ryan watched frozen for exactly 1.5 seconds as the truck's taillights shrank into the distance and disappeared around the next bend, leaving a cloud of dust and a body lying motionless on the shoulder of the road. Then something in him snapped into motion before his mind had even caught up. He slammed the brakes so hard his old truck fish-tailed tires screaming against the heat-softened asphalt. He didn't bother pulling fully onto the shoulder. He threw it into park in the middle of the lane, hazards flashing, and he was out the door and running before the engine had even finished shuddering to a stop. Hey, can you hear me?" The man on the ground didn't move. Ryan's boots pounded against the pavement, his heart slamming against his ribs so hard it hurt. Up close, the scene was worse than it had looked from the truck. The rider's leather jacket was torn open at the shoulder road rash, bleeding through denim. One leg twisted at an angle that made Ryan's stomach turn. His helmet had come off somewhere in the tumble, revealing a face streaked with blood and dust, gray beard matted with gravel, eyes closed. And behind him, 20 feet away, still spinning on its side, the motorcycle. Ryan smelled it before he saw it. Gasoline. A sharp chemical bite in the air, and underneath it, something worse. The metallic tang of a fuel line that had ruptured somewhere in the crash, leaking steadily onto pavement that had been baking in 95-degree heat for 6 hours straight. "Oh God," Ryan whispered. He didn't think about the danger. He didn't think about anything except the man in front of him breathing shallow but breathing, and the fact that every second he spent standing still was a second that man didn't have. "I've got you," Ryan said, dropping to his knees beside the rider. I've got you, man. Stay with me. There was no response. Just that shallow rise and fall of the chest and blood, too much blood, pooling beneath the man's shoulder. Ryan grabbed him under the arms. This is gonna hurt, he muttered more to himself than to the unconscious man. I'm sorry, I gotta move you. He pulled. The man was heavy dead weight, all muscle and leather, and gear easily 220 pounds, and Ryan's boots slid against loose gravel as he dragged him backward away from the wreck, away from the widening pool of gasoline that was creeping toward a downed power line, sparking uselessly against the guardrail. 10 feet, 15 feet. Ryan's arms were screaming, his lower back seizing with the strain, but he didn't stop, didn't even slow down, because some primal part of his brain was screaming louder than the pain. Get him away, get him away, get him away, 20 feet. He collapsed backward onto the gravel shoulder, the injured man's head cradled against his chest, both of them gasping, and for one suspended moment, the entire world went silent, except for the ragged sound of Ryan's own breathing. Then the motorcycle exploded. The blast wasn't like the movies. There was no dramatic fireball rolling into the sky. It was a sharp, violent whoomp of heat and pressure that Ryan felt against the back of his neck, even from 20 feet away, followed by a wall of black smoke and the horrible screech of metal warping in flame. Ryan's ears rang, his vision blurred at the edges, and underneath him, the injured man's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, unfocused, glassy, uncomprehending, before sliding shut again. Hey, stay with me, Ryan said, voice cracking. Stay awake, man, come on. He fumbled for his phone with shaking hands, punched in 911 with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. 911, what's your emergency? There's been a hit-and-run motorcycle accident Route 12 about 3 miles past the Millers Creek turnoff. He's unconscious. He's bleeding bad. The bike just exploded. I need an ambulance right now. Sir, is the victim breathing? Yeah, he's breathing, but it's shallow. I don't know what else is wrong with him. There's blood coming from his shoulder, and I think his leg might be broken. Okay, sir, help is on the way. Can you stay on the line with me? Ryan pressed the phone against his shoulder, both hands going back to the injured man, pressing a torn strip of his own shirt against the wound at his shoulder, applying pressure the way he vaguely remembered from some safety training years ago. Come on, Ryan muttered under his breath, over and over like a prayer. Come on, stay with me. That was when he heard the click of a phone camera. He looked up, startled, to see a woman standing on the opposite shoulder. She must have pulled over somewhere in the last-minute phone raised recording. Is he alive? She called out, voice trembling. Barely, Ryan shouted back. Call it in if you haven't already. I did, they're coming. The woman kept recording. Ryan didn't have time to care. Minutes stretched like hours. Ryan kept pressure on the wound, kept talking, kept saying whatever came to mind. The weather, the drive, anything to keep some thread of connection between himself and the unconscious man in his arms. Because some instinct told him that if he stopped talking, if he let the silence in, something would slip away that he wouldn't be able to get back. You're gonna be okay, Ryan said, not knowing if it was true, not caring, because it was the only thing he had to offer. You hear me? You're gonna be okay. That was when he saw it clearly for the first time, the patch on the back of the man's torn leather vest, scorched at the edges, but still legible. Hell's Angels. Ryan's stomach did something complicated. Not fear exactly. He'd grown up hearing stories about motorcycle clubs, the kind of stories that got exaggerated over beers at the local bar, stories about danger and violence, and men who lived outside the rules everyone else followed. But looking down at the man bleeding out in his arms, all Ryan saw was another human being. A father maybe, a husband, somebody's son. It didn't matter what patch he wore. It didn't matter what stories Ryan had heard. The sirens arrived 4 minutes later, though it felt like 40, and Ryan practically threw himself out of the way as paramedics swarmed the injured man, calling out numbers and vitals in clipped professional voices that meant nothing to Ryan except that they were working, they were trying, there was still a chance. Sir, are you hurt? One of the paramedics asked him, noticing the blood on his hands and shirt. No, this isn't mine, it's his, Ryan said, stepping back, suddenly aware of how badly his hands were shaking. I pulled him out before the bike blew. The paramedic's eyes widened slightly. You pulled him out? Yeah. How far? Ryan glanced back at the smoking wreckage, then at the paramedic. 20 feet maybe, I don't know, I wasn't really counting. The paramedic didn't say anything else. He just looked at Ryan for a long moment, the kind of look that carried more weight than words, before turning back to his patient. They loaded the injured man onto a stretcher. As they lifted him into the ambulance, his eyes opened again, just for a second, just long enough to focus, bloodshot, in pain but focused, and they found Ryan's face across the chaos of flashing lights and shouting voices. Their eyes held for exactly 2 seconds. Then the doors closed and the ambulance screamed away down Route 12, leaving Ryan standing alone on the shoulder of the road, hands trembling, shirt torn and bloodied, staring at the black smoke still curling up from what used to be a motorcycle. A police officer approached him a few minutes later, notebook in hand. "Sir, I'm going to need to get a statement from you." Ryan nodded numbly, still staring at the wreckage. Yeah, of course." He gave his statement in a flat mechanical voice. The pickup truck, the color, what little of the plate, he'd managed to catch the direction it had fled. The officer wrote it all down, nodding occasionally, glancing up at Ryan with an expression that seemed to be searching for something. "That took guts," the officer finally said, closing his notebook. "Most people would have just called it in and stayed in their car." Ryan shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what anybody would have done." The officer's eyebrows lifted slightly, like he wanted to disagree but decided not to push it. "Well, not everybody. You got somewhere to be. You're free to go. We've got what we need." Ryan nodded, already moving back toward his truck, already trying to shrink back into himself, back into invisibility, because that was the only way he knew how to exist in the world, quietly, without fanfare, doing what needed doing, and then disappearing before anyone could make a fuss about it. He didn't notice the woman with the phone still filming as he drove away. He didn't notice that somewhere that video was already being uploaded, already being shared, already spreading across the internet with a caption that read, "Stranger saves biker's life, seconds before explosion, no hesitation." He didn't know any of it. He just drove home, hands still trembling on the wheel, and when he pulled into the driveway of his father's small house on the edge of town, he sat there for a long moment before he found the strength to go inside. "Ryan!" His father's voice called from the living room, rough with age and pain medication. "That you?" "Yeah, Dad, it's me." Ryan stepped inside, and the familiar smell of the house coffee, worn leather, the faint medicinal smell that had become permanent since the accident, wrapped around him like it always did, grounding him. His father sat in his wheelchair by the window, a book open on his lap that he clearly hadn't been reading, his sharp eyes immediately catching on the state of Ryan's shirt. "What happened to you?" Daniel asked, voice suddenly alert, worried. "Is that blood?" "It's not mine," Ryan said quickly, moving toward the kitchen sink to wash his hands. "There was an accident on Route 12. Motorcycle got hit. I pulled the guy out before the bike caught fire." Silence. Ryan turned around to see his father staring at him, an expression on his face that Ryan couldn't quite read. Pride, fear, something in between. "You pulled him out," Daniel repeated slowly. "Somebody had to." "Ryan." His father's voice carried a weight that made Ryan stop, hands still dripping over the sink. "You could have been killed. That truck could have hit you too. That bike could have..." "But it didn't," Ryan said quietly, "and he's alive. That's what matters." His father studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, cracked open into something that looked almost like grief mixed with pride. "You're just like your mother," he finally said. "She used to say the same thing. Somebody had to." Ryan didn't say anything. He just finished washing the blood from his hands, watching the water run pink and then clear down the drain, and tried not to think about how close he'd come to losing everything on the side of that highway. He had no idea that 200 miles away, in a hospital room surrounded by machines and monitors, a man named Marcus Hawk Donovan was slowly regaining consciousness, and the first thing he would ask, through cracked and swollen lips, was not about his injuries. It would be about the young man who saved his life. Hawk had ridden with the Hells Angels for over 20 years. He'd survived things that would have killed lesser men, rival club conflicts in his younger, wilder days, 2 previous accidents, a stretch in prison he never talked about, and a divorce that had nearly broken him worse than any of it. He was 51 years old, built like a man who'd spent decades doing manual labor, and never stopped, with a gray beard trimmed close and gray hair pulled back, forearms covered in tattoos that told the story of a life lived hard and loud. He was not a man who was easily impressed, but when he woke in that hospital bed, disoriented and in pain, with tubes running into his arm and machines beeping steadily beside him, The fragmented memory that surfaced first before the pain, before the confusion, before even the fear was a face. A young man's face, blonde hair, dust and sweat in desperation, hands pulling him across pavement while a bike exploded behind them. Where? Hawk's voice came out cracked, barely audible. A nurse rushed to his side. Mr. Donovan, you're in the hospital. You were in an accident. Try not to move too much. Okay. The guy, Hawk rasped. A guy who? You need to rest, Kata. Who was he? Hawk's hand is shot out, gripping the nurse's wrist with surprising strength for a man who'd just woken from unconsciousness. The guy who pulled me out. Who was he? The nurse hesitated, clearly startled by the intensity in his eyes. I don't know, sir. A witness called it in. He left before we could get details. He left. That's what the paramedic said. He gave a statement to police, and then he left. Hawk stared at the ceiling, processing this. His mind still fogged with pain medication, but sharpening around this one detail like a blade finding its edge. A stranger had pulled him from a burning wreck. A stranger had risked his own life because that gasoline could have ignited at any second, could have taken them both for a man he'd never met. A man wearing colors that scared most people away rather than pulling them closer. And then he'd left. No name, no reward sought, no interview given. Just gone. Find him, Hawk said quietly, more to himself than to the nurse, his eyes drifting shut again as exhaustion pulled him back under. I need to find him. The nurse frowned, unsure what to make of the request, and made a note to inform the doctor that the patient seemed disoriented. She had no idea that within 24 hours, that single request would set into motion something far larger than anyone in that hospital room could have imagined. Ryan, meanwhile, was trying to forget the whole thing. He went to work the next morning like nothing had happened, showing up at the construction site at 6 a.m., sharp, hard hat on, ready to put in another 10-hour day pouring concrete for a new strip mall on the edge of town. His boss, a stocky, weathered man named Gary Fenn, who'd run Fenn Construction for over 20 years, caught him near the equipment shed before the crew got started. Walker, Gary said, waving him over. You see this? He held up his phone screen angled toward Ryan. Ryan's stomach dropped when he saw the video pause mid-frame, himself dragging an unconscious man across pavement, the motorcycle behind them. Where'd you get that? Ryan asked, voice tight. It's everywhere, kid. Local news picked it up this morning. Some lady filmed the whole thing. Gary's eyes were wide with something between shock and pride. You didn't say a word about this yesterday. You just showed up like normal. It wasn't a big deal, Ryan mumbled, looking away. Not a big deal. Gary let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Kid, you ran into traffic and dragged a man away from an exploding motorcycle. That's about as big a deal as it gets. Anybody would have done it. No, Gary said, his voice suddenly serious, all traces of humor gone. They wouldn't have. I've known you 3 years now, Ryan. You show up early, you stay late, you never complain, even when your back's about to give out from carrying more than your share. You think I don't notice you fixing old man Peterson's roof on your Saturdays off, or paying for Danny Ruiz's groceries last winter when his unemployment ran dry? Ryan's jaw tightened. How'd you know about that? Small town kid, people talk. Gary clapped a heavy hand on Ryan's shoulder. Point is, you're not surprised. Not to me anyway. But the rest of the world's about to find out what I already know. Ryan wanted to argue, wanted to deflect, wanted to disappear into the routine of the job the way he always did. But before he could say anything else, one of the other workers, a younger guy named Trevor, called out from across the yard. Hey, Ryan, you're famous, man. Channel 6 wants to interview you. Ryan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Tell them no. Seriously, free publicity, man, you could. I said no. Ryan's voice came out sharper than he intended, and Trevor's grin faltered. All right, just saying. Gary watched this exchange with narrowed, thoughtful eyes, but he didn't push. He just nodded slowly and headed off to check on the concrete delivery, leaving Ryan alone with the growing uncomfortable awareness that his quiet, invisible life had just become significantly less quiet and significantly less invisible. By lunch, 3 more news vans had shown up outside the site, and Ryan spent his entire break hiding in the equipment shed, eating a sandwich in silence, willing the day to move faster. He didn't know it yet, but 200 miles away, something else was happening, something that would make the news vans look like the least of his problems. In a clubhouse on the outskirts of Billings, a dozen men sat around a long wooden table, Phones out, all of them watching the same video on a loop. At the head of the table sat a broad-shouldered man named Victor Preacher, Kane Hawk's second in command, his weathered face grim as he watched the footage for the fifth time. "Somebody find out who this kid is," Preacher said, voice low and controlled. "Today." "Already on it," said a younger member, tapping away at his laptop. License plate on the trucks registered to Ryan Walker, 22 years old, lives just outside town with his father. Works construction. No record. Nothing. Nothing. Preacher raised an eyebrow. Not even a speeding ticket. Preacher sat back, arms crossed, studying the frozen frame on the screen. Ryan's face caught mid-motion, dragging Hawk's body across the pavement with an expression of pure, desperate focus. "Hawk's been asking for him non-stop since he woke up," Preacher said quietly. "Won't shut up about it. Says he needs to know who the kid is. You gonna go talk to him?" Preacher's eyes narrowed, something calculating passing behind them. "Not yet. First, I want to know everything about this Ryan Walker. Everything. Before we show our faces in that town, I want to understand exactly who we're dealing with." The young member nodded and went back to typing. And within hours, a quiet, informal investigation had begun, men calling in favors, checking with people who knew people, piecing together a picture of a 22-year-old construction worker who had absolutely no idea that an entire motorcycle club was suddenly very, very interested in him. What they found over the next several days would astonish even them. They learned about Daniel Walker's accident 3 years prior, the scaffolding collapse, the resulting paralysis, the mounting medical bills that had swallowed the family's savings whole. They learned Ryan had dropped out of a community college engineering program to work full-time, taking whatever hours he could get to keep his father in physical therapy and keep the lights on. They learned about the roof he'd fixed for an elderly widow 2 streets over, refusing payment even when she insisted. They learned about the groceries he'd quietly paid for outside the local supermarket, sliding cash to the cashier before a struggling veteran named Danny Ruiz even got to the register, then disappearing before Danny could thank him. They learned that when the local news had tracked down his employer for a comment Gary Finn had said on camera, "That kid's got more character in his little finger than most men have in their whole body." And they learned through a contact who worked at the hospital that Ryan had refused a modest reward the local Chamber of Commerce had tried to arrange for him, telling them, "I don't need anything, I just did what needed doing." Preacher read through the compiled notes with a growing sense of disbelief, sliding the folder across the table to Hawk, who was propped up in a hospital bed, shoulder heavily bandaged, leg elevated in a cast, but eyes sharp and alert, now fully conscious and fully himself. "You're not gonna believe this kid," Preacher said. Hawk read through the notes slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition, like he was seeing something in Ryan Walker's story that resonated with something buried deep in his own past. "He refused the interviews," Hawk said quietly, almost to himself. "Every single one. And the reward money, turned it down flat. Told the Chamber of Commerce he just did what needed doing." Hawk set the folder down on his lap, staring out the hospital window at the parking lot below his jaw, working silently for a long moment. 22 years old, Hawk finally said, working himself half to death to take care of his old man, fixing roofs for widows, paying for some vet's groceries, and not even sticking around to hear a thank you. He shook his head slowly, and then he runs into traffic to save a total stranger. A biker, no less. Somebody half this town probably assumes his trouble just from the patch on his back. "Yeah," Preacher said. "I want to meet him," Hawk said, his voice suddenly firm, decisive. "Once I'm out of this bed, I want to look this kid in the eye and thank him properly." "You sure that's a good idea? Showing up in a small town like that, dozen bikes rolling in might spook people. Might spook him." Hawk's eyes hardened slightly. "I'm not talking about rolling in with the whole club, Preacher. Not yet. I just want to talk to him. One-on-one, man-to-man." Preacher nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he was already thinking several steps ahead, already turning over ideas about what this could mean for Hawk, for the club, for a young man who had no idea the wheels he'd set in motion the moment he chose to run toward danger instead of away from it. Back in Montana, Ryan's world had begun to feel increasingly unfamiliar. It started with small things. A motorcycle parked across the street from the construction site one afternoon. Engine off, rider just sitting there watching. Ryan noticed it during his lunch break, felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. But when he looked again 10 minutes later, the bike was gone. Then it happened again the next day. A different motorcycle, this time parked near the gas station where Ryan filled up his truck after work. The rider, a heavy-set man with a graying beard and sunglasses, didn't approach him, didn't say a word, just watched from a distance as Ryan pumped gas, then rode off before Ryan could work up the nerve to say anything. "You seeing this?" Trevor asked him at work the following morning, nodding toward the street where yet another motorcycle idled half a block away. "Third one this week." "Yeah," Ryan said, jaw tight. "I've noticed." "You think it's about the video, like the guy's friends checking up on you or something?" "I don't know. Should we call the cops?" "Combo." Ryan hesitated, watching the distant figure on the motorcycle who made no move to approach. No threatening gesture, nothing but stillness and observation. They're not doing anything, not yet anyway. But the unease sat with him all day, a low hum of anxiety beneath the physical exhaustion of the job. And that night, as he sat with his father over a simple dinner of grilled chicken and steamed vegetables, Daniel noticed his son's distracted silence. "Something's bothering you," Daniel said, not a question. Ryan set down his fork. "There's been bikers around town, watching me." His father's face tightened with concern. "Watching you how?" "Just watching, not saying anything, not doing anything, just there and then gone." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on the table. "The man you saved, he was one of them, right? The Hells Angels." "Yeah. You think this is about him?" "I don't know what else it would be about." Ryan pushed his food around his plate, appetite gone. "Maybe they're checking to see if I talk to the press. Maybe they think I'm gonna sell my story or something. I don't know." "Or maybe," Daniel said slowly, "they're just curious about the man who saved one of their own and didn't ask for anything in return." "That's not something people expect anymore, Ryan. Not from strangers." Ryan didn't have an answer for that. He just stared at his plate, thinking about the 2 seconds his eyes had held with the injured bikers before the ambulance doors closed. 2 seconds that had somehow set something enormous into motion, something he didn't understand and couldn't control. He had no way of knowing that 3 days later, an envelope would arrive at his father's house, plain unmarked with nothing but his name written across the front in careful handwriting, and that opening, it would change the course of his entire life. The envelope sat on the kitchen table when Ryan got home from work, and his father was staring at it with a strange, guarded expression when Ryan walked through the door. "This came for you today," Daniel said. "Fella dropped it off himself, big guy. Beard, didn't say much, just asked me to make sure you got it." Ryan picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hands. No return address, no postage, just his name written in a hand that was surprisingly neat for what he imagined a biker's handwriting might look like. He tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it, in that same careful handwriting, was a short message. "Ryan, my name is Marcus Donovan. Most people call me Hawk. You saved my life 2 weeks ago on Route 12, and I never got the chance to thank you properly. I'd like to meet you if you are willing. No cameras, no crowd, just you and me. There's a diner off Route 9 about 15 miles east of town, the Copper Kettle. I'll be there Thursday at noon. I'll understand if you don't come, but I hope you will." Ryan read it twice, his heart pounding steadily harder with each line. And when he finally looked up, his father was watching him with an unreadable expression. "Well," Daniel asked, "what's it say?" "He wants to meet me," Ryan said quietly. "Thursday, just the two of us." His father was silent for a long moment, and Ryan could see the war happening behind his eyes, the instinct to protect his son clashing with something else. Something that looked almost like respect for the request itself. "You gonna go?" Daniel finally asked. Ryan looked back down at the letter, at the careful, deliberate handwriting, at the simple, humble request from a man who could have shown up with a dozen motorcycles and demanded Ryan's presence, but had instead written a quiet letter and asked. "Yeah," Ryan said, "I think I am." His father nodded slowly, though the worry didn't fully leave his eyes. "Just be careful, son." "I will." But even as he said it, Ryan felt something shift inside him, a strange, unfamiliar pull toward Thursday, toward the Copper Kettle, toward a conversation with a man whose life he'd saved, but whose world he knew almost nothing about. He had no idea that the meeting waiting for him would reveal something far bigger than a simple thank you, something that would test not just his courage, but his character in ways that would ripple far beyond that quiet diner, off Route 9, reaching into every corner of the small town he called home and changing the lives of people he hadn't even met yet. The 2 seconds on that highway had only been the beginning. The letter sat on Ryan's nightstand for 2 full days before Thursday arrived, and in that time he must have read it a dozen times, memorizing the careful handwriting until he could probably recite it in his sleep. Every time he looked at it, the same questions surfaced in his mind, sharp and insistent. Why would a man like Hawk want to sit across a table from him? He didn't have an answer. He just knew that Thursday was coming, and some part of him, the same part that had sprinted into oncoming traffic without a second thought, refused to let him back out now. Work on Wednesday felt endless. Ryan poured concrete, hauled lumber, followed Gary's instructions on autopilot, his mind circling back again and again to the diner, to the meeting, to a man he'd only seen unconscious and bleeding on the side of a highway. Trevor noticed his distraction almost immediately. "You're somewhere else today, man," Trevor said, wiping sweat from his forehead as they broke for a water refill. "You good?" "Yeah, just tired." "You sure? 'Cause you've been staring at that same beam for like 2 minutes. Ryan blinked, realizing Trevor was right. He forced a tight smile. "I'm meeting somebody tomorrow. Kind of a big deal." Trevor's eyebrows shot up. "The biker guy Hawk." Ryan's head snapped toward him. "How do you know that name?" "Dude, it's a small town, and apparently bikers don't exactly whisper when they're asking around about somebody. Half the guys at the hardware store were talking about it yesterday. Word is the club's been quietly digging up everything about you for the past week." A cold prickle ran down Ryan's spine. "Digging up what exactly?" "I don't know, man. Everything probably. Where you work, where you live, what you do on weekends." Trevor shrugged, though his expression carried a trace of concern beneath the casual tone. "You sure you want to go meet this guy alone?" Ryan didn't answer right away. He thought about the letter, the plain humble request, no cameras, no crowd, just a man wanting to say thank you. And he thought about his father's warning to be careful. And he thought about the strange, restless motorcycles that had circled the edges of his life for the past 2 weeks like slow-moving storm clouds. "I have to go," Ryan finally said. "If I don't, I'll never stop wondering what he wanted." Trevor didn't look convinced, but he let it go, and the two of them went back to work in silence, the afternoon sun beating down on the half-finished strip mall, while somewhere 200 miles away, preparations of an entirely different kind were underway. In Billings, Hawk sat in his living room for the first time since the accident, his cast propped up on a footrest, a cane leaning against the arm of his chair. He'd been discharged from the hospital only 2 days earlier against his doctor's strong recommendation, and Preacher had practically carried him out the door himself, muttering the entire time about hard-headed old men who didn't know when to rest. "You sure you're up for this tomorrow?" Preacher asked, standing near the window, arms crossed. "You can barely walk, Hawk." "I don't need to walk far. I need to sit across a table and talk to a kid." "You could have had him come here." "No." Hawk's voice was firm, final. "I'm not making that boy travel 2 hours to some clubhouse full of strangers. He's already scared enough, probably without me adding to it." Preacher studied him for a long moment, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes. "You've been different since you woke up. You know that?" Hawk didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window at the gray afternoon sky, his jaw working slowly. "You spend your whole life thinking you understand people," he finally said. "Thinking you know who's good and who's rotten, who will help you and who will walk past you bleeding in the street. And then some kid, some 22-year-old construction worker who's never even met you, runs through traffic to drag your sorry carcass away from a fireball and doesn't even stick around long enough to hear you say thank you." He shook his head slowly. "Makes a man rethink a few things." "You gonna tell him about the offer?" Hawk's eyes sharpened. "What offer?" "Come on, Hawk. I know you. I know that look. You're already planning something." A faint, tired smile tugged at the corner of Hawk's mouth. "Maybe. The club's not gonna love it if you start handing out favors to civilians. Some of the guys are already grumbling about all this attention. Video's got, 4 million views now. People are starting to recognize our patches in places they never used to notice us." "Let them grumble," Hawk said. "This isn't about the club's reputation. This is about a debt I owe a kid who never asked to be owed anything." He looked up at Preacher, his expression suddenly serious, weighted with something that looked almost like conviction. You understand what he did, preacher. He didn't know me, didn't know my name, didn't know what patch I wore till he saw it on my vest after he already had me 20 feet clear of that bike. He made the decision to save my life before he had any reason to. Preacher was quiet for a moment. Most people would have kept driving. Everybody else did keep driving. Hawk's voice carried a rare rawness to it now, something vulnerable beneath the gravel. Everybody except him. The room fell into a heavy silence, and outside the gray sky finally broke rain beginning to patter softly against the window. And somewhere in that quiet moment, a decision solidified in Hawk's mind, one that would change far more than just Ryan Walker's life. Thursday morning arrived with a nervous gray sky over Montana, low clouds threatening rain that never quite came. Ryan woke before his alarm, lying in bed for several long minutes, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible version of how the meeting might go. Maybe Hawk just wanted to say thank you and shake his hand. Maybe there'd be an awkward silence, some stilted conversation, and then it would be over and Ryan could go back to his normal life. Or maybe not. He got up, showered, dressed in the cleanest shirt he owned. Not how that he had many nice ones, and found his father already awake in the kitchen, coffee in hand, watching him with careful eyes. "You look like you didn't sleep," Daniel observed. "Didn't really." "You still going?" Ryan poured himself a cup of coffee, hands steadier than he expected. "Yeah." Daniel set down his mug, wheeling himself closer to the table. "Ryan, look at me." Ryan met his father's eyes. "Whatever this man wants from you," Daniel said slowly, "you don't owe him anything more than you already gave. You saved his life. That's the whole debt, far as I'm concerned. You don't have to take anything from him, and you sure as hell don't have to give anything more." "I know, Dad." "Do you?" His father's gaze was sharp, searching. "Because I know you, son. I know you'll walk into that diner, and if that man offers you the world, you'll try to hand half of it back to somebody else before you even think about keeping a dime for yourself." Ryan huffed a small, tired laugh. "Would that be so bad?" "No," Daniel said quietly, something softening in his weathered face. "It wouldn't be bad at all. It's just who you are. Your mother was the same way." He reached out, gripping Ryan's hand briefly. "Just be careful. That's all I ask." Ryan nodded, squeezed his father's hand once, and headed out the door toward his truck, the gray morning sky pressing low overhead as he pulled onto the highway toward Route 9. The Copper Kettle sat alone on a stretch of empty road, a squat, faded building with a gravel parking lot and a single flickering neon sign that read "Open" in dull red letters. Ryan pulled in at 11:55, 5 minutes early, his heart hammering as he scanned the lot. Only one motorcycle sat parked near the entrance. Just one. He parked his truck beside it, cut the engine, and sat there for a long moment, gathering himself before finally stepping out and walking toward the door. The bell above the entrance jingled softly as he stepped inside. The diner was nearly empty. An elderly couple in a corner booth, a waitress wiping down the counter, and in the back booth facing the door sat a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard trimmed neat and gray hair pulled back, a black leather vest hanging off his shoulders, one arm still in a sling, a cane resting against the table beside him. Hawk looked up as the bell jingled, and their eyes met across the diner. The same eyes that had held Ryan's for 2 seconds before the ambulance doors closed 2 weeks ago. Ryan froze for half a second, then forced his feet to move forward. "Mr. Donovan," he asked, voice quieter than he intended. "Hawk," the man corrected, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Please sit." Ryan slid into the booth, hands folding awkwardly on the table in front of him. Up close, Hawk looked older than he had on the highway, deep lines carved into a weathered face, a scar above one eyebrow that predated the accident by years, and eyes that were sharp, assessing but not unkind. "You came," Hawk said. "You asked." "Most people wouldn't have. Not after what they'd have heard about us." Hawk studied him for a long moment. "You know what people say about the Hells Angels in towns like yours?" Ryan hesitated. "Some things." "Say it. I won't be offended." "That you're dangerous, that you're trouble, that people should stay away." Ryan met his eyes steadily. "But I figured a man bleeding out on the highway is just a man bleeding out on the highway. Didn't much matter what patch he was wearing." Something flickered across Hawk's face, surprise maybe, or something closer to respect. "That's about the most honest answer I've gotten from anybody in a long time." The waitress approached, and Hawk ordered coffee for both of them without asking, then waited until she'd walked away before continuing. "I want to tell you something," Hawk said, leaning forward slightly, despite the visible strain in his shoulder. 20 years I've ridden with this club. 20 years I've watched people cross the street when they see us coming, lock their car doors, pull their kids closer. He shook his head slowly. Some of that I earned. I won't lie to you about that. I wasn't always a good man, and some of the things this club's done over the years, they weren't things I'm proud of. Ryan said nothing, just listened, sensing that Hawk needed to say this before anything else could happen between them. But what you did, Hawk continued, voice lower now, rougher, you didn't know any of that. You didn't know if I was a good man or a bad one. You just saw somebody dying and you ran toward it instead of away from it. Most people, even good people, they freeze. Or they call it in and stay safe in their car and tell themselves that's enough. His eyes locked onto Ryan's, intense, unwavering. You didn't do that. I couldn't just leave you there, Ryan said simply. Why not? The question caught Ryan off guard. What do you mean, why not? I mean exactly what I said. Why not? You had every reason to keep driving. Nobody would have blamed you. Nobody would have even known you'd seen the crash if you'd just driven past. Ryan was quiet for a moment, searching for an answer that felt true. My mom used to say that the world doesn't need more people watching bad things happen. It needs more people willing to do something about it, even when it's scary, even when it's not their problem. He looked down at his hands. She passed when I was 12. Cancer. But I think about the things she used to say sometimes when I don't know what else to do. Hawk was silent for a long moment, something raw and unguarded passing across his weathered face. She sounds like she raised a hell of a man, Hawk finally said. Ryan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly, and he cleared it, looking away toward the window. I just did what anybody should have done. No. Hawk's voice was firm now, almost sharp. Stop saying that. I need you to understand something, Ryan. Not everybody does what you did. Almost nobody does what you did. I've spent 2 weeks having my club dig into your life, and you know what we found? Ryan's stomach tightened. What? We found a kid who works himself half to death supporting his father. We found a kid who fixed an old widow's roof for free and wouldn't take a dime for it. We found a kid who paid for a struggling veteran's groceries and disappeared before the man could even say thank you. Hawk's eyes bore into him. We found a kid who turned down television interviews and refused a reward from his own town's Chamber of Commerce. You didn't do any of that for attention, Ryan. You did it because it's just who you are. Ryan felt heat rising in his cheeks, an uncomfortable mixture of embarrassment and something he couldn't quite name. You had people investigating me. I needed to know who I owed my life to, Hawk said simply. And what I found humbled me, son. Genuinely humbled me. The waitress returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting them down before retreating again. And for a moment the two men sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them like something tangible. I want to do something for you, Hawk finally said, breaking the silence. Something real. Not a handshake and a thank you. Something that actually matters. Ryan's guard immediately went up. You don't owe me anything. I owe you my life. You don't owe me anything, Ryan repeated firmer this time. I didn't do it for a reward. I don't want money. I figured you'd say that, Hawk said, a faint knowing smile touching his lips, which is exactly why I know you're the right person to help. Ryan frowned, confused. Help with what? Hawk leaned back, slightly wincing at the movement, and studied Ryan for a long moment before speaking again. I have resources, Ryan, real resources. The club's built up connections over the decades, legitimate businesses, legal investments, people who owe favors. I could write you a check right now that would change your life, and you'd tell me, no, wouldn't you? Yeah, Ryan admitted, I would. That's what I thought. Hawk nodded slowly. So instead, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer. If you could have anything not for yourself, but for somebody else, somebody who deserves it and never asked for it, what would it be? Ryan blinked, caught off guard by the question. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I said. You've spent your whole life taking care of everybody around you and asking for nothing in return. So I'm asking you now, not what do you want, because I already know you won't tell me, but what does somebody else deserve that they'll never ask for themselves? Ryan sat back, the question settling into him slowly, and unbidden an image rose in his mind. Gary Fenn standing at the equipment yard staring at a decades-old excavator, that broke down more often than it ran, muttering under his breath about contracts he'd had to turn down because the company simply didn't have the machinery to handle them. My boss, Ryan said slowly, Gary Fenn, he's run his construction company for over 20 years. Built it from nothing. He's the fairest boss I've ever had, pays overtime without complaining, never docks anybody's pay for showing up 5 minutes late. If there's a good reason, covered my hospital copay out of his own pocket once, when my dad's insurance dragged its feet. Ryan's voice grew steadier as he continued. He's been trying to buy new equipment for 10 years. A real excavator, real machinery, not the rusted out stuff we're patching together just to get through each job. Every time he gets close to affording it, something else eats the money, repairs insurance, hikes a slow season. He's never once complained about it in front of us, but I've seen him turn down jobs because we didn't have the equipment to handle them. Jobs that would have meant hiring more guys, paying better wages, growing the company into something bigger. Hawk listened to all of this without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when Ryan finished, the diner fell into a heavy contemplative silence. You had the chance to ask for anything, Hawk finally said, and you asked for something for another man. I told you I don't want anything for myself. I heard you. Hawk's eyes were bright now, something fierce and moved burning behind them. I heard you loud and clear. He reached for his coffee, took a slow sip, and when he set the cup back down, his expression had shifted into something resolute, decided. All right, Hawk said, here's what's going to happen. Ryan leaned forward, slightly uncertain what to expect. I'm going to help your boss get his equipment, Hawk said. Not as charity, as an investment. My club has legitimate business interests, construction logistics, a few properties we manage across 3 states. I'm going to have my people reach out to Fenn Construction and offer a legal, transparent business partnership. New equipment, expanded contracts, everything above board, every dollar traceable and legitimate. He paused, watching Ryan's reaction carefully. But I want something in return. Ryan tensed. What? I want you in that company's future, Hawk said. Not as a favor to Mippen, as an investment in you. I looked into your background too, son. You had an engineering scholarship lined up before your father's accident, forced you to drop out and start working full-time. I want to fund the rest of your education, heavy equipment, engineering, whatever certification you need, so that when Fenn Construction expands, you're not just pouring concrete anymore. You're running the operation, building something real. Ryan sat frozen, the weight of the offer settling over him slowly, and for a long moment he couldn't find the words to respond. He started, then stopped, shaking his head. That's too much. I can't accept that. You're not accepting it for yourself, Hawk said quietly. You're accepting it because it's the only way your boss gets his equipment, because it's the only way that company grows and hires more guys from your town who need the work, because it's the only way this actually helps the people you were really thinking about when I asked you that question. His eyes softened slightly. You wanted to help somebody else, Ryan. This is how you do it. Let me help you help him. Ryan's throat tightened, and he looked down at his hands, feeling something overwhelming rise in his chest. Gratitude, disbelief, and underneath it all, a stubborn resistance to accepting anything that felt like more than he deserved. Why does any of this matter to you? Ryan finally asked, looking back up. You could have just shaken my hand and walked away. Why go through all this? Hawk was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the gray Montana sky beyond the glass. Because I spent 20 years watching this world convince people that kindness is weakness, Hawk finally said. That looking out for a stranger is foolish. That the only smart move is to protect yourself and let everybody else fend for themselves. His eyes returned to Ryan, steady and intense. And then a 22-year-old kid proved that theory wrong in about 2 seconds flat on the side of a highway for a man he'd never met. He shook his head slowly. I've got money, Ryan. I've got resources. What I don't have is many chances left in this life to prove that theory wrong myself. You're giving me that chance. I'd be a fool not to take it. The diner fell silent again, save for the quiet clink of the elderly couple's silverware in the corner booth and the low hum of the ancient refrigerator behind the counter. I need to think about it, Ryan finally said. This is a lot. Take all the time you need, Hawk said. But Ryan? He paused, waiting until Ryan met his eyes again. Don't think about it too long. Your boss has waited 10 years for this. I'd hate for pride to cost him another 10. Ryan felt a small, reluctant smile tug at the corner of his mouth despite everything. That's a low blow. I'm an old biker, son. I fight dirty when it matters. A faint smile crossed Hawk's face, too softening the weathered lines around his eyes. But I mean every word. They talked for another 20 minutes. Smaller things now less weighted. Hawk asking about Ryan's father, about the construction work, about what Ryan actually wanted to do with his life, if money and circumstance weren't standing in the way. Ryan found himself talking more freely than he expected, the tension slowly draining from his shoulders as the conversation shifted from negotiation to something closer to genuine connection. When they finally stood to leave, Hawk extended his good hand and Ryan shook it firmly. Thank you. Hawk said, his voice thick with something sincere. Not just for saving my life, for proving something I'd almost stopped believing. You don't have to keep thanking me, Ryan said, feeling his face warm again. I know. That's exactly why I'm going to keep doing it anyway. Ryan left the diner with his mind spinning, the gray sky finally beginning to clear. As he climbed into his truck, and he sat there for several long minutes before starting the engine, replaying the entire conversation, still not quite believing what had just been offered to him. He drove home in a daze, and when he walked through the door, his father was waiting, watching him with searching eyes. Well, Daniel asked, how'd it go? Ryan sank into the chair across from him, running a hand through his hair. Dad, you're not going to believe what just happened. He told him everything, the diner, the conversation, Hawk's investigation into his life, the offer to fund Gary's equipment, and Ryan's education. His father listened in stunned silence, his expression shifting through disbelief, suspicion, and finally something that looked almost like awe. And you're considering it? Daniel asked when Ryan finished. I don't know, Ryan admitted. It feels like too much, like I don't deserve it. Ryan, his father's voice was firm, cutting through his son's uncertainty. You dragged a man away from a fireball with your bare hands. You've spent 3 years working yourself to the bone to take care of me without a single word of complaint. If anybody in this world deserves a little bit of good fortune finding its way back to them, it's you. He reached across the table, gripping Ryan's hand. Don't let pride talk you out of something that could change Gary's whole business. Change your whole future. This isn't about you being greedy. It's about you finally letting somebody help for once instead of always being the one doing the helping. Ryan sat with that for a long moment, his father's words settling into the same place in his chest where Hawks had landed hours earlier. I need to talk to Gary first, Ryan finally said, before I say yes to anything. He needs to hear this from me, not from some stranger showing up at his office with a business proposal. Daniel nodded slowly, approval clear in his eyes. That sounds like exactly the right way to handle it. The next morning, Ryan arrived at the construction site early, catching Gary alone in the equipment shed, coffee in hand, examining the rusted hydraulics on their decades-old excavator with a familiar expression of quiet frustration. Gary, can I talk to you for a minute? Gary looked up, surprised by the seriousness in Ryan's voice. Everything all right, kid? Yeah, no, I don't know. Ryan took a breath, steadying himself. I met with the man I saved, Hawk, yesterday. Gary's expression sharpened with interest. And Ryan told him everything, watching Gary's face shift from skepticism to disbelief to something that looked almost like he was holding his breath, afraid to let himself hope too often. He wants to fund new equipment for the company, Ryan finished. A legitimate business partnership, he said. Expanded contracts. He wants to pay for me to finish my engineering certification too, so I can help run operations once things scale up. Gary was silent for a long moment, staring at the excavator he'd been babying along for the better part of a decade, patching leaks and jury-rigging parts just to keep it running one more season. Why would he do that? Gary finally asked, voice rough. For me, he doesn't even know me. Because I told him about you, Ryan said. He asked me what I wanted, and I told him I didn't want anything for myself. He asked what somebody else deserved, and I thought about you, about how you've spent 20 years trying to grow this company the right way and kept getting knocked back by bad luck and worse equipment. Gary's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ryan worried he'd overstepped, worried Gary would see this as pity rather than gratitude. Instead, Gary set down his coffee, ran a hand over his face, and when he looked back up at Ryan, his eyes were wet. 20 years, Gary said quietly. 20 years I've been trying to get this company to a place where I could hire more guys, pay better wages, take on the bigger contracts that actually build something lasting for this town instead of just scraping by job to job. He shook his head slowly. And you're telling me a biker I've never met wants to hand me that chance because you saved his life and asked for nothing but a favor for somebody else. I told him I needed to talk to you first, Ryan said, before anything moves forward. This isn't my decision to make. It's yours. Gary was quiet for a long moment, studying Ryan with an expression that carried decades of hard-won respect. 3 years ago when your dad had his accident, half the guys on my crew figured you'd quit within a month, figured the stress would break you, or you'd get bitter, or you'd just disappear into your own grief and never come back to work the same. He shook his head slowly. You didn't just come back the same kid. You came back better, harder working, more generous somehow, even with less to give. His voice caught slightly. I don't know what I did to deserve an employee like you, but I sure as hell am not going to turn down a chance to keep growing this business with you leading the charge. So you'll do it. Damn right I'll do it. Gary's face broke into a wide, disbelieving grin, years of exhaustion momentarily lifting from his weathered features. Set up the meeting, kid. Let's see if this Hawk fella's serious. Ryan felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. And for the first time since the accident on Route 12, he allowed himself to feel something close to excitement about what might be coming. He called the number Hawk had given him that evening, and within 2 days a formal meeting was arranged. Hawk preacher and a lawyer representing the club's legitimate business interests, sitting down with Gary Fenn in the small cluttered office of Fenn Construction to discuss terms. Ryan sat in on the meeting at Gary's insistence, watching as papers were laid out on the desk, as numbers were discussed with a transparency that surprised him, as Hawk personally walked Gary through every detail of the proposed partnership, refusing to let a single clause go unexplained. I want you to understand exactly what you're signing, Hawk said at one point, tapping the contract firmly. No hidden strings, no favors owed beyond what's written here in black and white. This is a legitimate investment, and if at any point you feel like something's off, you walk away, no questions asked, no consequences. Gary read through the contract twice, consulting quietly with a lawyer of his own that Ryan hadn't even known he'd hired, and by the end of the meeting, his hand was steady as he signed his name at the bottom of the page. Welcome to the partnership, Hawk said, extending his hand. Gary shook it firmly, his eyes bright with an emotion he didn't bother hiding. Thank you, genuinely. You have no idea what this means. I think I have some idea, Hawk said, glancing briefly at Ryan with a small, knowing smile. As the meeting wrapped up and everyone began gathering their things, Preacher pulled Ryan aside near the door, his expression more serious than Ryan had seen from any of the bikers so far. You know what you just did, right? Preacher asked quietly. I didn't do anything, Ryan said. This is Hawk's doing. No. Preacher shook his head firmly. This is your doing. Hawk's got money, sure, resources, connections, all of that. But he's offered plenty of people, plenty of things over the years, and most of them take whatever's offered and run. You looked him in the eye and asked for something for somebody else. His eyes held Ryan's with an intensity that made Ryan's chest tighten. That's rare, kid. Rarer than you know. Don't ever let anybody talk you out of being that kind of person. Ryan didn't quite know how to respond, so he just nodded, and Preacher clapped him firmly on the shoulder before following Hawk out to the parking lot. Over the following days, the equipment began arriving: a brand new excavator, upgraded hydraulic tools, a fleet update that transformed Fenn Construction's capabilities almost overnight. Word spread quickly through town, and with it came a wave of curiosity and speculation that Ryan hadn't fully anticipated. Is it true the Hells Angels are basically running your boss's company now? A woman asked him at the grocery store one afternoon, not unkindly, just curious. No, Ryan said patiently. It's a business investment, totally legal, nothing sinister about it. Not everyone was so easily convinced. A local town council meeting the following week turned into an unexpectedly tense affair, with several older residents voicing concerns about a motorcycle club gaining financial influence in their small community. I don't care how legal the paperwork is, one man said, standing up during the public comment period, his voice sharp with suspicion. You're telling me a bunch of outlaws just decided to invest in a construction company out of the goodness of their hearts? There's got to be an angle here. Gary, sitting in the audience, stood up before Ryan could react. The angle, Gary said calmly, is that a 22-year-old kid who works for me ran into traffic and saved a man's life without asking for a single thing in return. And when that man wanted to say thank you, my employee asked for something to help our company grow instead of asking for anything for himself. Gary's voice grew firmer, steadier. I've read every line of that contract myself with my own lawyer present. It's legitimate, it's transparent, and frankly, it's given my company a chance to hire 6 more guys from this town over the next year. Guys with families who need steady work. He looked around the room slowly. So before anybody starts assuming the worst about people they've never actually met, maybe consider judging them by what they've actually done instead of what patch they happen to wear. The room fell into an uncomfortable, thoughtful silence, and though the skepticism didn't fully disappear, something shifted in the room's mood, a grudging willingness at least to wait and see rather than condemn outright. Ryan, sitting near the back, felt a swell of gratitude toward Gary that he didn't quite know how to express, and later that night, walking out to his truck in the dim parking lot, he found Preacher leaning against his motorcycle waiting. Heard about the council meeting, Preacher said. News travels fast. Small town. Preacher's expression was unreadable in the dim light. Your boss defended us pretty hard in there. Didn't have to do that. He believes in doing right by people, Ryan said. Same as he's always done. Preacher nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. Hawk wanted me to give you this. Didn't want to make a big thing of it, so he asked me to pass it along quiet. Ryan took the paper, unfolding it slowly under the dim parking lot light. It was a letter shorter than the first one, but the words hit him with unexpected weight. Ryan, words getting around town about what you did and what your boss did standing up for us tonight. People are starting to see what I saw the moment I found out who you were. I want you to know something, and I want you to really hear it. This isn't finished. There's more coming. Something bigger than equipment and contracts. Something I think you're going to need some time to wrap your head around. Trust me a little longer, Hawk. Ryan read the letter twice, a slow unease creeping into his chest alongside something that felt almost like anticipation. What does he mean, something bigger? Ryan asked, looking up at Preacher. Preacher's expression remained carefully neutral, though something like a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. That's between you and Hawk, kid. All I know is he's been on the phone nonstop for the past 3 days, talking to people I've never even heard him mention before. Old contacts, people from way before my time with the club. He pushed off from his motorcycle, swinging a leg over. Whatever it is, it's big enough that Hawk hasn't told anybody the full details yet, not even me. Ryan watched him ride off into the darkness, the folded letter still clutched in his hand, and as he climbed into his own truck and started the engine, he found himself staring out at the empty road ahead, his mind spinning with questions he had no way of answering. Something bigger was coming. He had no idea that within days that same quiet road would fill with more motorcycles than the town had ever seen in its history. Engines roaring in perfect formation, drawing every resident out of their homes and businesses to witness something that would leave the entire community speechless. Something that would prove, once and for all, that the 2 seconds Ryan Walker had spent running toward danger instead of away from it had set into motion a chain of events far larger than he could have ever imagined. The days after Preacher's late-night visit passed strangely for Ryan. Work continued, the new equipment humming steadily at the site, Gary walking around with an energy Ryan hadn't seen in him in 3 years. But underneath all of it, Ryan couldn't shake the words from Hawk's letter. Something bigger. Something I think you're going to need time to wrap your head around. He tried not to think about it too much. He tried and failed. You've read that letter like 50 times, his father said one evening, watching Ryan turn the folded paper over in his hands at the kitchen table for what had to be the 6th time that week. I can't figure out what he means, Ryan admitted. Maybe it's not something you're supposed to figure out, Daniel said. Maybe it's something you're supposed to wait for. Ryan hated waiting. He always had. But there was nothing else to do. So he folded the letter one more time, tucked it into his nightstand drawer, and tried to focus on the one thing that still felt entirely his own, the work, the routine, the quiet satisfaction of watching Fen construction slowly transform in front of his eyes. The new excavator alone had changed everything. Jobs that used to take a week now took 3 days. Gary had already signed 2 new contracts bigger than anything the company had taken on in years. And true to his word, he'd hired 6 new workers from town, men who'd been unemployed or underemployed for months, men with families who needed steady paychecks. You did this, Gary told Ryan one morning, watching the new hires unload equipment from the yard. Whatever else happens, you did this. You did this, Ryan corrected. I just made a phone call. Gary shook his head, smiling faintly. Kid, you're gonna spend your whole life deflecting credit, aren't you? Ryan just shrugged, uncomfortable, but as always with praise, and went back to work. It was nearly 2 weeks after the diner meeting when Preacher showed up at the construction site itself, parking his motorcycle near the entrance and waiting by the gate until Ryan noticed him during a water break. Preacher. Ryan wiped sweat from his forehead, walking over. Everything okay? Hawk wants to see you today, if you can manage it. Something in Preacher's tone made Ryan's stomach tighten. Is he all right? His leg. He's fine. Healing up faster than the doctors expected, actually. Stubborn old man refuses to slow down. Preacher's expression remained carefully neutral, the same guarded look he'd worn the night he delivered the letter. This isn't about his health. He's got something to tell you. Wanted to do it in person. Ryan glanced back toward the site where Gary was directing the new crew around the excavator. I've got another 4 hours on shift. He said whenever you're free, no rush, just... Preacher hesitated, something almost like reluctance crossing his weathered face. Just don't wait too long, all right? This one's been eating at him. Ryan nodded slowly, unease settling deeper into his chest, and when his shift finally ended that evening, he drove straight to the address Preacher had given him, not the clubhouse, but Hawk's own home, a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Billings that looked nothing like what Ryan had expected. Hawk answered the door himself, moving more easily now, though a slight limp remained from the accident. He looked older somehow, standing there in the doorway, older than he had even in the hospital, like whatever he was about to say had already begun aging him before the words left his mouth. Ryan, thanks for coming. Hawk stepped aside, gesturing him in. Come sit. I owe you an explanation. The inside of the house was simple, unassuming worn leather furniture, a wall of old photographs Ryan didn't have time to examine closely, a kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee. Hawk led him to a small living room and gestured for him to sit before lowering himself carefully into the chair across from him, wincing slightly as his legs settled. I need to tell you something, Hawk began, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. Can you do that? Ryan's pulse quickened. Okay. Hawk was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Ryan hadn't heard from him before. Not the confident, commanding tone from the diner, but something rawer, more exposed. 25 years ago, Hawk said slowly, I had a son. The words landed heavy in the small room, and Ryan sat very still, sensing immediately that this was not a story that would be easy for Hawk to tell. His name was Michael, Hawk continued. He was 17. Good kid. Better than I deserved, honestly, considering the life I was living back then. I wasn't around much. Club business, road trips, the kind of chaos that came with the life I'd chosen. His mother left when he was 9, took him with her, and I saw him maybe a handful of weekends a year. Hawk's jaw tightened. I told myself I'd make it up to him. Someday, when things settled down, when the club's business was more stable, when I had more time. Ryan didn't say anything, just watched Hawk's weathered face, carefully sensing the story was building towards something painful. One night, Hawk said, voice dropping lower, Michael was driving home from a friend's house. Rural road, real similar to the one where you found me, actually. A drunk driver crossed the center line, hit him head on. Hawk's hands trembled slightly where they rested on his knees. There was a witness, somebody driving 20 yards behind him, saw the whole thing happen. Ryan's chest tightened, already sensing where this was going, dreading it. That witness didn't stop, Hawk said. Didn't call it in for almost 20 minutes. Said later he panicked, didn't want to get involved, wasn't sure what he'd seen. His voice cracked slightly. By the time the ambulance got there, it was too late. The doctors told me if somebody had called sooner, if somebody had stopped, tried to help, even just applied pressure to slow the bleeding, Michael might have made it. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. I'm so sorry, Ryan said quietly, the words feeling insufficient even as he said them. Hawk nodded slowly, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, not bothering to hide the emotion anymore. 25 years, Ryan. 25 years I've carried that. Not just the grief of losing him, though God knows that never goes away, but the anger, the fury at a world where somebody could watch a boy dying and just keep driving, where somebody could tell themselves their own comfort mattered more than a stranger's life. His eyes lifted, meeting Ryan's directly. That's the world I've lived in for 25 years, a world that taught me people look out for themselves first every single time, and anybody who tells you different is either lying or hasn't been tested yet. Ryan felt his own throat tightening, understanding now, with sudden, overwhelming clarity, why this man had reacted so powerfully to a young construction worker running into oncoming traffic for a stranger. And then you, Hawk continued, voice thick. A kid I've never met wearing no colors owing me nothing, watching a stranger's motorcycle burst into flames. You didn't hesitate. You didn't drive past. You didn't wait 20 minutes deciding whether to get involved. His hand came up, pressing briefly against his chest. You proved the world I built in my head for 25 years wrong. In 2 seconds. On a highway just like the one that took my son. Ryan didn't trust himself to speak. He just sat there, absorbing the weight of what Hawk had just handed him. Not gratitude anymore, but something far deeper, something that felt almost sacred in its rawness. Why are you telling me this now? Ryan finally managed. Hawk took a slow breath, steadying himself. Because I need you to understand why what I'm about to offer you means more to me than money ever could. This isn't charity, Ryan. This isn't even really about gratitude anymore, not entirely. This is about a debt I've owed the universe for 25 years, and you're the first person who's ever given me a way to pay even a fraction of it back. What do you mean? Hawk reached beside his chair, pulling out a thick manila folder Ryan hadn't noticed before setting it on the coffee table between them. After Michael died, Hawk said, I threw myself into the club even harder. Convinced myself that if the world wasn't going to look out for people, I'd build my own world that did, even if it looked ugly from the outside, even if people crossed the street when they saw us coming. But somewhere along the way, I lost track of the actual point. Got caught up in power and reputation, in protecting what we'd built, instead of protecting people the way I'd always told myself we were supposed to. He tapped the folder. This is a fund, something I started years ago and never quite knew how to use properly. Money set aside, legitimate, taxed, entirely legal, meant to help families going through exactly what mine went through. Sudden loss. Medical bills that spiral out of control. Kids who have to grow up faster than they should because life didn't give them a choice. Ryan stared at the folder, not yet understanding. I want you to help me run it, Hawk said. Ryan's head snapped up. What? I've got money, Ryan. I've got resources, connections, decades of business experience within the club's legitimate operations. What I don't have is somebody the community will actually trust to be the face of it. Somebody people believe is doing this for the right reasons, not for some hidden angle. Hawk's eyes were steady, pleading in a way Ryan hadn't expected from a man like him. You could be that person. Not right away. I know you're still finishing your engineering certification, still helping Gary get the company on its feet. But eventually, a foundation run in your name, if you want it that way, or anonymously, if you'd rather stay out of the spotlight, helping families in this state who are drowning, the way my family drowned, the way your family nearly drowned after your father's accident. Ryan sat back, overwhelmed, his mind racing to keep pace with everything Hawk was laying in front of him. Ryan shook his head slowly. This is a lot bigger than the equipment for Gary. I know. I don't know if I'm the right person for something like this. You're exactly the right person, Hawk said firmly, because you'll never do it for the wrong reasons. I've watched men my whole life chase money, chase power, chase reputation, and it corrupts every single one of them eventually. You turn down television interviews. You turn down a reward from your own town. You ask for equipment for your boss before you'd even consider anything for yourself. His voice grew quieter, more intense. That's exactly the kind of person who should be deciding which families get help and which programs get funded. Somebody who'll never lose sight of why it matters. The conversation stretched on for another hour. Hawk walking Ryan through the details of the fun years of quiet discipline saving from legitimate business ventures the club had built over decades, largely untouched, waiting for a purpose Hawk had never quite been able to define until now. Ryan asked question after question, his engineer's mind instinctively probing for structure, for logic, for the practical mechanics of how something like this could actually function. By the time Ryan finally left Hawk's house that night, the sky had gone fully dark, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky, and he sat in his truck for a long time before starting the engine, trying to process everything he'd just heard. He hadn't given Hawk an answer yet. He'd asked for time, and Hawk patient understanding, in a way that surprised Ryan given everything he now knew about the man's grief, had simply nodded and told him to take whatever time he needed. But driving home that night, Ryan couldn't stop replaying one particular image in his mind. Hawk's trembling hands, the crack in his voice, as he described a phone call 25 years old that had never stopped ringing in his memory. He didn't sleep much that night. The following morning, everything changed with a single phone call. Ryan was on site helping guide the new excavator through its paces on a fresh job, a small commercial building on the edge of town, one of the contracts made possible by the club's investment, when his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. "This is Ryan," he answered, wiping dust from his hands. "Ryan Walker." The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, unfamiliar. "This is Detective Sarah Mills, Montana Highway Patrol. I'm calling regarding the hit-and-run incident on Route 12 back in June. Do you have a few minutes?" Ryan's stomach tightened. Yeah, of course." "We've made an arrest," Detective Mills said. "A man named Curtis Boyle, 38 years old. We got him on unrelated charges last week, DUI, actually second offense. And during processing, one of our officers noticed damage on his pickup truck that matched the description you gave us. Green paint transfer, front bumper damage consistent with a collision." Ryan's grip tightened on the phone. "You're sure it's him?" "We're confident, but we need your testimony to make it stick." He's denying everything, of course, and without a witness willing to testify, his lawyer's already pushing to get the charges reduced to a simple hit and run with minimal jail time, maybe even probation. Detective Mills's voice carried a note of frustration. "But if you're willing to testify to what you saw the truck swerving into him deliberately, speeding up afterward instead of stopping, we can push for attempted vehicular assault. That's real time, Ryan. That's justice for what happened to Mr. Donovan." Ryan felt something hot and sharp rise in his chest, an anger he hadn't fully allowed himself to feel until this moment. "I'll testify, whatever you need." "There's something else you should know," the detective continued, her voice growing more careful. "Curtis Boyle has a history with motorcycle clubs. Not the Hells Angels specifically, but he's had run-ins before a rival club situation a few years back that turned violent. We're looking into whether this was random or whether he specifically targeted Mr. Donovan because of the patch he was wearing." Ryan's blood ran cold. "You think this was intentional because he's a biker?" "We're investigating that angle, yes. If it's confirmed, we're looking at a hate crime enhancement on top of the assault charges." Detective Mills paused. "I need to ask you something, Ryan, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Since the accident, have you noticed anything unusual? Anyone following you, watching you, anything that felt threatening?" Ryan thought immediately of the motorcycles that had circled the edges of his life for weeks. But those had turned out to be Hawk's people, watching, investigating, ultimately protective rather than threatening. "No," Ryan said slowly, "nothing like that." "Good. But I want you to stay alert, all right? If this was targeted and if Boyle has associates who aren't happy about his arrest, there's a small possibility they could try to intimidate witnesses. I don't say that to scare you. I say it because I want you prepared." Ryan's hand had gone white-knuckled around the phone by the time the call ended, his mind spinning with implications he hadn't considered before. This hadn't just been a random accident. Somebody had deliberately run Hawk off the road, possibly because of who he was, because of the patch on his back, because of exactly the kind of prejudice Hawk had spent the last hour telling Ryan he'd spent his whole life fighting against. He called Hawk immediately. "They caught him," Ryan said the moment Hawk picked up. "The driver. Detective just called me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Curtis Boyle," Hawk finally said, his voice flat, controlled in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than if he'd shouted. "That name mean anything to you?" "No, should it?" "I know him," Hawk said grimly. "Or I know of him anyway. Rode with a rival club years back before they folded. Had a grudge against us that went back further than I care to explain over the phone." A pause, heavy and tense. "This wasn't an accident, Ryan." "That's what the detective thinks too." She said to her, looking at a hate crime enhancement. Another long silence, and when Hawk spoke again, his voice had dropped even lower. Quieter, more controlled, the voice of a man forcing himself to stay calm through sheer will. "I need you to be careful," Hawk said. "Boyle's got people. Not many, not anymore, but enough that this could get complicated if they decide to make noise. The detective already warned me about that." "Good. Listen to her." Hawk's voice hardened. "And Ryan, don't take matters into your own hands if anything happens. Don't confront anybody. You call the police, you call me, And you let this play out the right way, through the courts, through legal channels. You understand. I understand. I mean it, son. I've seen too many good men make one bad decision when they're angry and pay for it the rest of their lives. You're not going to be one of them, not over this. Ryan promised, though the anger sitting in his chest didn't fully dissipate. And over the following days, that anger only grew as the investigation unfolded, revealing layer after layer of a story far uglier than a simple road rage incident. Curtis Boyle, it turned out, had a documented history of targeting Hells Angels, members going back nearly a decade vandalizing motorcycles, following members home from bars, once even setting fire to a member's garage in an incident that had never been definitively pinned on him. His hatred for the club, prosecutors would later argue, stemmed from a violent falling out with his own former club years earlier, a grudge that had calcified into something far darker and more dangerous over time. The local news picked up the story within days, and this time Ryan couldn't avoid the attention even if he'd wanted to. Reporters called his phone constantly. A journalist from a regional paper showed up at the construction site uninvited, cornering him during a break. "Mr. Walker, can you comment on reports that this was a targeted hate crime against a motorcycle club member?" "I can't comment on an ongoing investigation," Ryan said, echoing the exact phrase Detective Mills had coached him to use before walking away as quickly as he could manage. The pressure mounted from every direction. His father worried, constantly checking the locks on the house twice each night, a habit Ryan hadn't seen from him since before the accident that had put him in a wheelchair. Gary insisted on walking Ryan to his truck after every shift, citing vague concerns about just being careful, though Ryan suspected Hawk had said something to him directly. Then 10 days after the arrest, everything escalated in a way nobody had anticipated. Ryan was leaving the courthouse after giving a preliminary statement to prosecutors, walking through the parking lot toward his truck, when a man he didn't recognize stepped directly into his path. "You're the kid who's testifying against Curtis," the man said. He was younger than Ryan expected, maybe 30, with a shaved head and a nervous, aggressive energy that immediately set Ryan on edge. "Excuse me," Ryan said, stepping back slightly. "Curtis is a good man, made one mistake, and now you're trying to send him away for years over it. Real hero, huh? Sticking your nose in something that had nothing to do with you." Ryan's pulse spiked, adrenaline flooding through him, but he forced himself to stay calm, remembering Hawk's warning. "I'm not looking for trouble. I saw what I saw, and I told the truth about it. That's all this is." "That's all this is," the man repeated, mocking, stepping closer. "You know what happens to witnesses who talk, kid. You think those bikers are going to protect you forever. You think, is there a problem here?" The voice came from behind Ryan, calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority, and Ryan turned to see two uniformed courthouse security officers approaching, drawn by the tension in the parking lot. The man's aggressive posture immediately deflated, and he took a step back, hands raised slightly. "No problem, just talking." "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave the premises," one of the officers said firmly. The man shot Ryan one last hard look before turning and walking quickly toward the street, disappearing around the corner before Ryan could even process what had just happened. His hands were shaking as he finally made it to his truck, and he sat there for several long minutes before he trusted himself to drive. He called Detective Mills the moment he got home. "He didn't threaten you directly?" she asked once Ryan had recounted the incident. "Not directly, but it felt like a threat." "I believe you. Unfortunately, without an explicit threat on record, there's not much we can charge him with beyond a trespassing warning, which security already handled." Her voice grew serious. "But this confirms what we suspected. Boyle's got people willing to intimidate witnesses. I want you to consider whether you're comfortable continuing with the testimony, Ryan. Nobody would blame you if you—" "I'm not backing out," Ryan said immediately, firmly. There was a pause on the other end. "You understand the risk you're taking?" "I understand it," Ryan said. "But if I back out now because some guy tried to scare me in a parking lot, then Curtis Boyle gets away with nearly killing a man just because of a patch on his vest. I'm not letting that happen." Detective Mills was quiet for a moment. "All right, but I want extra patrols near your home and workplace for the next few weeks just as a precaution." That night, Ryan told his father and Gary about the parking lot confrontation, watching both their faces tighten with concern. "You should have told me that this was getting dangerous," Daniel said, wheeling closer, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. I don't want you putting yourself at risk over this, Ryan. Haven't you already given enough? I'm not backing down, Dad. I'm not asking you to back down. I'm asking you to be careful. There's a difference. Ryan nodded, though the tension in the house remained thick for the rest of the evening, and when Hawk called later that night, his voice carried a barely contained fury that Ryan had never heard from him before. Somebody approached you at the courthouse, Hawk said. It wasn't a question. How did you? I have people everywhere, Ryan. I told you that. Hawk's voice was low controlled, but underneath it, Ryan could hear something dangerous simmering. Describe him to me. Hawk, I don't think. Describe him. Ryan hesitated, then relented, giving a brief description. Shaved head, aggressive energy, roughly 30 years old, and there was a long silence on the other end of the line before Hawk spoke again. That's one of Boyle's old associates, guy named Danny Petrov. Small time, mostly harmless on his own, but not somebody who acts without being told to. Told by who? That's what I intend to find out. Hawk's voice had gone cold sharp, the voice of a man who had spent decades commanding respect through sheer force of will. But I want you to hear me clearly on this, Ryan. Nobody threatens you, not while I'm breathing. You understand me, Hawk, I'm not talking about violence, Hawk said, cutting him off before Ryan could even voice the concern building in his chest. I promised you I wouldn't handle this the old way, and I meant it. I'm talking about making sure Boyle's associates understand very clearly that intimidating a witness in this case is the single worst decision they could possibly make legally and in terms of who's watching them from now on. That's it. That's all I'm doing. Ryan wasn't fully reassured, but something in Hawk's tone told him arguing further wouldn't change anything. So he let it go, and over the following week, whatever quiet pressure Hawk applied seemed to work. No further confrontations occurred. No more strangers approached him in parking lots, and the extra patrols Detective Mills had arranged seemed for now to be enough of a deterrent. But the entire experience had shifted something in Ryan, hardening a resolve that had already been forming since his conversation with Hawk about Michael, about the 25 years of grief and anger that had shaped the man Hawk had become. He understood now more fully than he had before exactly what was at stake, not just for Hawk, not just for himself, but for a pattern of quiet, unpunished prejudice that had apparently been simmering beneath the surface of Boyle's hatred for years, waiting for an opportunity to turn violent. The trial date was set for 6 weeks out, and in the meantime, life continued its strange, uneasy rhythm work during the day, quiet vigilance in the evenings, and beneath it all, the unanswered question of Hawk's foundation still sitting heavy in Ryan's mind. It was during this stretch of uncertainty that Ryan finally sought out his father's counsel more deeply than he had in years, sitting with him one evening on the back porch, the Montana sky stretching wide and star-scattered above them. I don't know if I can say yes to Hawk's foundation, Ryan admitted, staring out at the darkness. Not with everything happening with the trial. It feels like too much on top of everything else. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. You know what I think about sometimes sitting in this chair, he finally said. I think about all the plans I had before the accident. All the things I was going to do, going to build, going to teach you someday when you were old enough to want to learn. His voice grew softer. Then one afternoon on a job site, all of that got taken away in about 4 seconds. Just like that. No warning, no chance to prepare. Ryan turned to look at him, uncertain where this was going. Point is, Daniel continued, you never know how much time you've got to actually do the things that matter. Hawk's offering you a chance to build something that could change hundreds of lives, maybe thousands over the years. Families going through exactly what we went through, and you're sitting here telling me it feels like too much. He shook his head slowly, a faint knowing smile touching his weathered face. Son, the things that matter most in this life are always going to feel like too much right up until you're in the middle of doing them. Then somehow you find the strength. Ryan sat with that for a long time, the crickets chirping steadily in the darkness around them. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a new certainty. I'm going to do it, he said. The foundation. I'm going to help Hawk build it. Daniel reached over, gripping his son's shoulder firmly. I know you will. You were always going to say yes. You just needed a little time to hear yourself say it. Ryan called Hawk the next morning, and when he told him his decision, there was a long pause on the other end of the line before Hawk finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion he didn't bother hiding. You have no idea what this means to me, Hawk said quietly. I think I might, Ryan said, thinking of Michael of 25 years of grief, transformed finally into something that might actually help somebody else avoid the same devastating loss. They spent the following weeks working out the foundation structure between Ryan's shifts at the construction site and preparations for the upcoming trial meetings with lawyers, discussions about which families in the region needed help. Most urgently, careful planning that gave Ryan's naturally organized mind something productive to focus on amid the underlying tension of the case against Curtis Boyle. But just as things seemed to be settling into a manageable rhythm, 3 days before the trial was set to begin, Ryan's phone rang late at night, waking him from a restless sleep. It was Detective Mills, her voice tight with urgency. "Ryan, I need you to stay calm, but I need to tell you something important right away." Ryan sat up immediately, his heart already pounding. "What happened?" "Curtis Boyle made bail this afternoon. His lawyer got a judge to approve release pending trial." A pause heavy with implication. "And about 2 hours ago, we got a report that his truck was seen parked near your father's house." The room seemed to tilt around Ryan, ice flooding through his veins. "Is my dad?" "Your father's fine as far as we know, but Ryan, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because the next 72 hours are going to determine everything that happens in this case, and possibly everything that happens to your family." "Ryan, are you listening to me?" Ryan was already moving, the phone pressed to his ear, yanking a shirt over his head with his free hand. "I'm listening. I'm on my way to my dad's right now. I don't want you driving over there alone and confronting anybody," Detective Mills said, her voice sharp with warning. "I've got a patrol car en route to the house right now. I need you to let them get there first." "That's my father, Detective. I'm not sitting here waiting." "Ryan." He hung up before she could finish, grabbing his keys off the counter, and within 90 seconds, he was in his truck tires, spitting gravel as he tore out of his own driveway and onto the dark, empty highway toward his father's house. His hands were shaking on the wheel, not from fear for himself, he didn't have room for that right now, but from a raw, primal terror that gripped him at the thought of his father alone in that house, unable to run, unable to defend himself the way he once could have. He called his father's phone. It rang 4 times before Daniel picked up, voice groggy with sleep. "Ryan, it's the middle of the night. Dad, listen to me. Lock the doors. Lock every door and window right now. Don't open them for anybody except the police. You understand me? Not anybody." His father's voice sharpened instantly, all traces of sleep gone. "What's happening?" "Boyle made bail. His truck was seen near the house a couple hours ago. I'm 5 minutes out. Police are on their way too." "Ryan." His father's voice cracked, not with fear for himself, Ryan realized, but with fear for his son, racing down a dark highway toward whatever might be waiting. "Slow down, you hear me? Don't you dare wrap that truck around a tree, trying to get here faster." "I'm almost there, Dad." "Ryan Walker, I mean it." The line went quiet for a beat, and then Ryan heard something that made his blood run cold. His father's voice no longer talking to him, but pulled away from the phone, sharp and alarmed. "Who's out there?" Dad, what's going on?" "Somebody's on the porch. Ryan, I can see a shadow through the..." A pause, agonizingly long. "Hold on, Dad." The line stayed open, but Ryan could hear nothing now, except his father's ragged breathing and the distant, unmistakable creak of the front door hinge. Ryan floored the accelerator, his old truck screaming down the empty highway at a speed he'd never dared push it to, before his heart slamming against his ribs so hard it hurt, every worst-case scenario flooding his mind at once. "Dad, talk to me, Dad." Then faintly his father's voice again, and this time it carried something Ryan hadn't expected at all, confusion rather than terror. "Ryan, it's not him. It's not Boyle." Who is it?" "It's..." A pause. "Ryan, there's about a dozen motorcycles parked outside my house right now." Ryan's foot eased slightly off the gas, disbelief momentarily cutting through the panic. "What?" "I think it's Hawk's people," Daniel said, voice still shaky but steadying. "There's a big fella out here, says his name's Preacher, says Hawk sent them the second he heard about the bail." Ryan arrived 4 minutes later, tires skidding into the driveway, and the sight that greeted him nearly buckled his knees with relief. A dozen motorcycles lined the street outside his father's house, engines silent now, their riders standing in a loose, watchful perimeter around the property. Preacher stood on the porch beside his father's wheelchair, arms crossed, scanning the darkness beyond the yard with the focused intensity of a man who took his responsibility seriously. "Dad," Ryan sprinted from his truck, dropping to his knees beside his father's wheelchair, hands gripping his shoulders, checking him over frantically. Are you okay? Did anybody? I'm fine, son. I'm fine. Daniel gripped Ryan's wrist, steadying him, his own composure returning now that his son was safely in front of him. Scared me half to death when I heard footsteps on the porch, but it was just these fellas checking the perimeter. Ryan looked up at Preacher, still catching his breath. How did you know? Hawks had eyes on Boyle's bail hearing since this morning, Preacher said. The second word came through that he'd made bail. Hawk had half the club rolling toward your father's place before the ink was even dry on the paperwork. We've been out here for almost an hour already. You should have called me. Hawk didn't want to worry you until we knew there was actually something to worry about, Preacher said. Figured you had enough on your plate without imagining worst-case scenarios for an hour straight. A patrol car finally pulled up moments later, red and blue lights washing silently over the scene, and a young officer stepped out visibly startled by the sight of a dozen bikers standing guard around the property. Everything all right here? The officer asked, hand instinctively hovering near his belt. Everything's fine, Officer, Daniel said calmly. These men are here protecting my family. Nothing to worry about. The officer looked between the bikers and Daniel's steady expression, clearly uncertain how to process the scene, but after a brief radio check with Detective Mills confirming the situation, he relaxed slightly, agreeing to remain parked outside for the rest of the night as an additional precaution. Ryan sat with his father on the porch long after the officers had settled into his car, the bikers maintaining their quiet watch at the edges of the property, and for the first time since Detective Mills's call, Ryan allowed himself to breathe properly. You scared me half to death, Ryan admitted, voice still unsteady. You scared me worse, Daniel countered, flying down that highway like a bat out of hell. I could hear the engine through the phone, Ryan. You're lucky you didn't wrap that truck around a fence post. I wasn't going to let anything happen to you. Daniel's expression softened, and he reached over, gripping his son's hand tightly. I know, son, I know, but you got to understand something. If something happened to you trying to protect me, that wouldn't be a victory. That would be the worst thing that could possibly happen. His voice thickened with emotion. You're the only family I've got left, Ryan. Don't you ever forget that. They sat in silence for a while after that, the cool night air settling around them, and eventually Preacher approached, crouching down to their level. Boyle's not going to try anything tonight, Preacher said. Word's already spreading that we're watching. Man's not stupid enough to make a move with this many eyes on him. What about tomorrow next week? Ryan asked. We'll have somebody nearby until the trial's over, Preacher said. Hawk's orders. Not obvious, not intimidating, just present, enough to make sure Boyle and whoever he's got left thinks twice. Ryan felt a swell of gratitude he didn't quite have words for, and when Hawk himself called an hour later, his voice tight with barely restrained fury, Ryan found himself in the strange position of trying to calm the older man down rather than the other way around. I should have seen this coming, Hawk said. I should have had somebody watching the second he made bail. You had somebody there within the hour, Ryan said. My dad's fine, Hawk. Nothing happened. Nothing happened this time. Hawk's voice was hard, controlled fury simmering just beneath the surface. Boyle's out there right now, Ryan, and he knows exactly where your father lives. That's not a coincidence. That's a message. So what do we do? There was a long pause on the line. We do this the right way, Hawk finally said, though Ryan could hear the effort it took him to say it. We let the system work. We keep your father protected. We keep you protected, and in 6 weeks we let a jury put that man away for what he actually did. Another pause. But I want you to know something, Ryan. If anything happens to you or your father before this trial, the system's not going to be fast enough for me. You understand, Hawk? I'm not talking about violence, Hawk said quickly. I promised you that, and I meant it. I'm talking about making sure the world knows exactly what kind of man Curtis Boyle is, exactly what he's capable of, before he ever gets the chance to hurt anybody else. There's more than one way to make sure justice actually happens. Ryan didn't fully understand what Hawk meant by that, but the conviction in the older man's voice left no room for doubt that he intended to follow through one way or another. The following weeks passed in a strange, tense rhythm. Ryan went to work each day, the construction site buzzing with the steady hum of the new equipment contracts, continuing to expand, new hires settling into their roles under Gary's careful management. But beneath the surface of normal life, A current of vigilance ran through everything bikers rotating, watched near his father's house, in shifts, subtle enough that most neighbors never even noticed. Detective Mills checking in twice a week with updates on the case, and Ryan himself constantly aware of his surroundings in a way he'd never had to be before. Curtis Boyle, for his part, seemed to retreat into a strange, sullen silence following the incident at the house. No further confrontations occurred. No more strangers approached Ryan in parking lots. Whatever message Hawk's people had sent that night, it appeared to have landed. Then 10 days before the trial, Detective Mills called with news that changed everything. "We found something," she said, her voice carrying an edge of controlled excitement. A witness came forward. Somebody who was at the bar Boyle drank at that afternoon before the accident. Heard him talking about it beforehand. Ryan's grip tightened on the phone. Talking about what exactly? About running one of those biker types off the road if he got the chance that day. Said it to a bartender who's willing to testify, plus 2 other patrons who overheard it. Detective Mills's voice grew firmer. "This isn't just physical evidence anymore, Ryan. This is premeditation. This is exactly the hate crime enhancement we were hoping to establish." Ryan felt something loosen in his chest for the first time in weeks. Not full relief, not yet, but the first genuine sense that justice might actually be within reach. He called Hawk immediately with the news, and the older man was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "Premeditated," Hawk finally repeated, his voice carrying a complicated mixture of vindication and renewed grief. He was planning to do this to somebody. Didn't even matter who, as long as they wore the wrong patch. Hawk on. "I'm all right," Hawk said, though his voice suggested otherwise. "I'm all right. This is good news, Ryan. This is exactly what we needed." But Ryan could hear the old wound beneath the words. Michael's death resurfacing again. The same senseless hatred and carelessness that had taken his son, now nearly claiming another victim 25 years later. The trial began on a gray Tuesday morning, the small county courthouse packed tighter than Ryan had ever seen it. Word had spread throughout the region about the case, drawing local reporters, curious residents, and much to the visible discomfort of the presiding judge, a significant contingent of Hell's Angels members who filled nearly 2 full rows of the gallery, dressed respectfully, silent, watchful. Ryan sat beside his father in the front row, Gary on his other side, having insisted on taking the day off work to be there for support. Hawk sat directly behind them, his cane resting against the bench, his expression carefully composed despite the visible tension in his jaw. Curtis Boyle sat at the defense table, considerably smaller in appearance than Ryan remembered from the brief, terrifying parking lot encounter, a thin, nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear as the proceedings began. The prosecution's opening statement was methodical, laying out the timeline of events with clinical precision. The deliberate swerve, the acceleration afterward, the witness testimony about premeditation, the pattern of prior incidents targeting motorcycle club members that painted a damning picture of calculated hatred, rather than a simple moment of reckless anger. When Ryan was finally called to testify, his legs felt unsteady as he made his way to the witness stand. But the moment he settled into the seat and looked out at the courtroom, his father's steady gaze, Gary's supportive nod, Hawk's unwavering attention, something in him solidified. "Mr. Walker," the prosecutor began, "can you describe for the court exactly what you witnessed on the afternoon of the accident?" Ryan told the story again, the same story he'd now told countless times. The horn, the swerve, the motorcycle sliding across the pavement, the pickup truck accelerating away instead of stopping. But this time, standing before a jury who held Curtis Boyle's future in their hands, every word carried weight he hadn't fully felt before. "And after you pulled Mr. Donovan to safety," the prosecutor continued, "what did you observe about the defendant's vehicle?" "It didn't slow down," Ryan said clearly. "It sped up. Whoever was driving wanted to get away as fast as possible." The defense attorney during cross-examination tried repeatedly to poke holes in Ryan's account, questioning the distance, the lighting conditions, the speed at which everything had happened, suggesting that perhaps Ryan's memory of events had been colored by the trauma of the situation. "Isn't it possible," the defense attorney pressed, "that in the chaos and adrenaline of the moment, you simply misjudged what you saw, that this was in fact a tragic accident rather than an intentional act?" Ryan met the attorney's eyes steadily. "I saw a truck deliberately cross into another vehicle's lane, make contact, and then accelerate away without stopping to help. I've relived that moment every single day since it happened. I know exactly what I saw. The defense attorney, sensing he wasn't going to shake Ryan's certainty, moved on, but the damage to his client's case had already been done, Ryan's calm, unwavering testimony standing in stark contrast to the growing mountain of evidence, suggesting premeditation. The trial stretched across 4 tense days, witness after witness, building an increasingly damning case. The bartender who'd overheard Boyle's threats beforehand, forensic evidence confirming the deliberate nature of the collision, character witnesses testifying to Boyle's documented history of harassment against motorcycle club members dating back years. Hawk did not testify. His lawyer had advised against it, worried that the raw grief still visible whenever the topic of Michael arose might complicate the jury's perception, and Hawk had reluctantly agreed, though Ryan could see how badly the older man wanted to stand up and speak his piece. On the final day, as closing arguments concluded and the jury filed out to deliberate, the courtroom fell into a tense waiting silence. Ryan sat with his father, Gary, and Hawk in a small hallway outside the courtroom, nobody quite able to make conversation, the weight of the wait pressing down on all of them. "How long do you think it'll take?" Ryan finally asked, breaking the silence. "Could be hours," Hawk said. "Could be days if they're being thorough." It took 6 hours. When the bailiff finally called them back into the courtroom, Ryan's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat, his father's hand gripping his own tightly as they took their seats. The jury foreman stood, and the judge asked the question that would determine everything. "On the charge of attempted vehicular assault with a hate crime enhancement, how do you find guilty?" The word landed like a physical weight lifting off Ryan's chest, and beside him, he heard his father's sharp intake of breath, felt Gary's hand clap firmly onto his shoulder. Behind them, a low murmur rippled through the rows of bikers, restrained but unmistakable in its relief. Hawk didn't say a word. He just sat very still, staring at the back of Curtis Boyle's head, as the man was led away in handcuffs, his expression unreadable. Though Ryan could see his jaw working silently, could see something wet gathering in the corner of his eyes, that he refused to let fall in front of the courtroom. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed immediately, shouting questions, cameras flashing, and this time Ryan didn't try to avoid them entirely. He stopped briefly, long enough to make a single statement. "Justice was served today," Ryan said simply. "Not just for Mr. Donovan, but for everybody who's ever been targeted, just for who they are, what they wear, what group they belong to. Hate doesn't get to win, not today." He walked away before any follow-up questions could catch him, finding Hawk standing slightly apart from the crowd, staring off toward the horizon with an expression Ryan hadn't seen from him before, something that looked almost like peace mixed still with old unhealed grief. "You okay?" Ryan asked, approaching him carefully. Hawk was quiet for a long moment. "Michael would have been 42 years old this year," he finally said. "Would have had kids of his own, probably. A whole life I never got to see." His voice caught slightly. "This doesn't bring him back, Ryan. I want you to know that. Nothing that happened today undoes what happened 25 years ago." "I know. But it means something," Hawk continued, his voice growing steadier. "It means the next kid who gets targeted because of a patch on his back, because of who he loves, because of the color of his skin. Whatever it might be, it means people are starting to understand that hatred doesn't get a free pass anymore. Not in this state, not while I am still breathing." He turned to look at Ryan directly. "And that's because of you. Because you stood up in that courtroom and told the truth, even after somebody tried to scare you out of it." Ryan didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded, and the two of them stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment before Preacher approached, informing them that the club had gathered nearby, waiting to hear the verdict. "They want to see you," Preacher told Ryan. "All of them. Been waiting all day." Ryan glanced at Hawk, uncertain. "See me?" Hawk's expression shifted into something warmer, almost mischievous, despite the emotional weight of the day. "Come on, son. There's something I've been wanting to show you for weeks now, and I figured today's as good a day as any." They drove together to a large open field on the outskirts of town, and as Ryan pulled in behind Hawk's car, his breath caught in his throat at the sight waiting for him. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. Far more than the 12 that had guarded his father's house that night. Far more than the handful who'd filled the courtroom gallery. This was the club's full regional membership engines. Silent riders standing in loose clusters, all of them turning to watch as Ryan stepped out of his truck. "What is this?" Ryan asked, glancing at Hawk. "This," Hawk said, "is just the beginning of something I think you're going to want to see for yourself, but not today." He clapped a hand on Ryan's shoulder, his eyes bright despite the exhaustion of the trial. Today, we celebrate. Tomorrow, I've got a surprise waiting that's going to change your whole town's perspective on what just happened here. Ryan opened his mouth to ask what he meant, but Preacher was already ushering him forward into the crowd of bikers who parted respectfully to let him through. Several of them reaching out to shake his hand, to clap him on the shoulder, murmuring words of gratitude and respect that left Ryan overwhelmed in a way he hadn't expected. An older biker with a long gray beard approached him directly, gripping his hand firmly. "You don't know what you did today, kid. 25 years we've watched Hawk carry that grief around like a stone in his chest. Today's the first day I've seen that stone get a little lighter." Ryan felt his throat tighten, unable to find adequate words, and he simply nodded, accepting the gratitude with the same quiet humility that had defined every step of this journey since the moment he'd sprinted into oncoming traffic without a second thought. As the sun began to set over the field, casting long golden light across the gathered crowd, Hawk climbed onto the back of a nearby flatbed truck, raising a hand for quiet. 25 years ago, Hawk began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "I lost my son because a stranger decided his own comfort mattered more than a dying boy's life. I built a wall around myself after that, told myself the world was full of people who'd do the same given the chance." He paused, his eyes finding Ryan's in the crowd. This kid tore that wall down in about 2 seconds flat on the side of a highway for a man he'd never met. The crowd remained silent, respectful, hanging on every word. Today, a jury told Curtis Boyle that hatred doesn't get a free pass in this state, that you can't target somebody just because of the colors they wear, the group they belong to, and expect to walk away clean. Hawk's voice grew stronger, more resolute. But justice in a courtroom is only half the story. The other half happens in moments like this, when a stranger chooses courage over comfort, when a community chooses to stand together instead of turning away. His eyes swept across the crowd. "Tomorrow I want every single one of you here back in Ryan's town, because I've got something planned that I think this community needs to see. Something that shows them exactly who we are, beyond the patches and the reputation." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd, and Ryan felt a fresh wave of nervous curiosity building in his chest, unsure exactly what Hawk had planned, but sensing from the weight of the older man's words that it would be something far bigger than anything that had come before. That night, driving home with his father, Ryan found himself unable to shake the anticipation building steadily in his chest. "You have any idea what he's planning?" Daniel asked. "None at all," Ryan admitted. "But knowing Hawk, it's going to be something the whole town remembers for a long time." He had no idea just how right he was. The following morning arrived clear and bright. The Montana sky stretched wide and blue over the small town that had, over the past several months, become the unlikely center of the story that had captured attention far beyond its own borders. Ryan woke early, restless with anticipation, and by the time he arrived at the construction site for his usual shift, he could already sense something different in the air. A stillness, a quiet expectancy that seemed to hang over the entire town. "You hear anything yet?" Gary asked, meeting him at the equipment yard, his own expression carrying a mixture of curiosity and nervous excitement. "Nothing," Ryan said. "Hawk said I'd know when the time came." They didn't have to wait long. Around 10 in the morning, a low rumble began building in the distance, faint at first, easy to dismiss as distant thunder or passing trucks on the highway, but growing steadily louder, more distinct, until it became unmistakable. Engines, dozens of them, then hundreds. Workers across the construction site stopped what they were doing, turning toward the sound, and within minutes people began emerging from shops and homes throughout the small downtown area, drawn by the same growing rumble that seemed to be shaking the very air itself. Ryan's heart began pounding as he made his way toward the main street, Gary close behind him, and what he saw when he arrived stole the breath from his lungs entirely. Motorcycles. As far as the eye could see, stretching down the highway in perfect disciplined formation. Engines roaring in unified thunder that echoed off the surrounding hills. Hundreds of them, more than Ryan had ever imagined existed within a single chapter, all moving in careful, deliberate procession toward the heart of town. The streets filled rapidly with residents drawn from their homes and businesses, confusion and apprehension evident on many faces as the seemingly endless line of motorcycles continued rolling into view. A few police cars appeared, officers standing beside their vehicles, watching warily but making no move to intervene, clearly having been given advance notice of what was coming. And there at the very front of the formation, unmistakable even from a distance, rode Hawk himself, legs still healing, but sitting tall and proud atop his own motorcycle, leading his entire regional chapter into the small Montana town that had become over the past several months inextricably linked to his own story of grief, transformed into something unexpected. The procession came to a slow, coordinated stop in the center of town, engines idling in a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, and for a long, suspended moment, nobody moved. The residents stood frozen on the sidewalks, uncertain and watchful. The bikers remained mounted on their machines, patient, disciplined, radiating none of the aggression the town might have expected from such an overwhelming show of numbers. Then Hawk dismounted, moving carefully with his still healing leg, and walked to the center of the street, and the entire town watched in tense silence as he raised a hand signaling for quiet, even though the crowd had already fallen still on its own. "My name is Marcus Donovan," Hawk called out, his voice carrying clearly across the silent street. "Some of you know me as Hawk. Some of you that have probably heard rumors about who I am, what my club represents, whether we belong anywhere near your town." He paused, scanning the crowd slowly. "I'm not here today to ask you to trust us. I'm here to tell you a story and then let you decide for yourselves." Ryan stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, his father beside him in his wheelchair. Gary on his other side, watching as Hawk began recounting the story that had brought them all to this moment. The accident, the rescue, the 2 seconds that had changed everything. But as Hawk continued speaking, Ryan realized with a jolt that this wasn't simply a story about gratitude anymore. It was about to become something the entire town would never forget. "I lost my son 25 years ago." Hawk continued, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was saying. "Michael, 17 years old, a stranger watched him die on a road just like the ones running through this county, and that stranger decided his own comfort mattered more than a dying boy's life. He drove away, didn't call for 20 minutes. By the time help arrived, it was too late." A hush fell deeper over the crowd residents, who had gathered out of curiosity, now standing rooted with something closer to reverence. "For 25 years, Hawk went on, I told myself the world was full of people like that stranger. Told myself that was just how people were, self-interested, unwilling to risk anything for somebody they didn't know." His eyes swept the crowd before landing deliberately on Ryan. "And then 3 months ago on Route 12, a truck ran me off the road. My bike caught fire. I was unconscious, bleeding 20 feet from an explosion that would have killed me." He gestured toward Ryan, and every head in the crowd turned to follow the motion, hundreds of eyes suddenly fixed on him. Ryan felt his face flush hot, his instincts screaming to shrink backward, but his father's hand found his and squeezed once firm and grounding, and he held his ground. "This kid," Hawk said, "who'd never met me, who had no idea what patch I wore, until he'd already dragged me clear of the wreck, ran into oncoming traffic without a second's hesitation. Didn't stop to think about his own safety. Didn't stop to wonder if I was a good man or a bad one. He just saw somebody dying and did something about it." Hawk's voice thickened. 2 seconds. That's all it took him to prove 25 years of my own bitterness weren't wrong. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Ryan caught sight of Mrs. Halloway, the elderly widow whose roof he'd fixed 2 summers back, standing near the front with tears already gathering in her eyes, nodding along like she'd known all along this day was coming. "I offered this young man money," Hawk continued. "He turned it down. I offered him fame, a spotlight, every television interview he could ever want. He turned that down too. You know what he asked for instead?" Hawk paused, letting the silence stretch. "He asked me to help his boss, a man named Gary Fenn, who spent 20 years building an honest company in this town and never once had the resources to grow it the way it deserved." Gary, standing beside Ryan, went rigid with surprise, clearly not having expected to be called out in front of the entire town. "That equipment humming away at Fenn Construction right now," Hawk said. "The new hires, the expanded contracts that happened because this kid thought about somebody else before he thought about himself. Every single time." He shook his head slowly, something raw crossing his weathered face. "And when Curtis Boyle tried to intimidate him into silence during the trial that just put that man behind bars, for what he did to me, Ryan didn't back down. He testified. He told the truth, knowing full well what it might cost him." The crowd's attention had shifted, now a collective understanding dawning across dozens of faces at once. This wasn't simply a motorcycle club rolling into town to say thank you. This was something the community itself had been circling without fully realizing it, a reckoning with assumptions many of them hadn't even known they were carrying. I know what some of you have thought watching us ride through your town these past few months, Hawk said. I know what the patches on our backs make people assume. I'm not here to pretend that reputation came from nowhere. Some of it we earned a long time ago in a different life. His gaze swept the crowd slowly. But I'm asking you to look at what's actually happened here. A company that's hired 6 new workers from this town. A young man who risked everything to make sure his boss and his community benefited before he ever thought about himself. A trial that put a dangerous man behind bars because people were willing to stand up and tell the truth. He turned, gesturing toward the formation of motorcycles stretching down the street behind him. Every single person you see here today rode 200 miles because a 22-year-old construction worker reminded us what we're supposed to stand for. Not fear, not intimidation, family, protecting people who can't protect themselves, standing up when it's easier to look away. His voice rose, carrying clear and strong across the silent street. So today we're not asking anything from you. We're just here to say thank you out loud in front of everybody, the way this young man deserves. He turned and nodded toward Preacher, who stepped forward, carrying a large framed document, walking it directly to Gary Fenn. Mr. Fenn, Hawk said, your company's partnership with our organization is fully paid, fully transparent, and permanently secured. No strings, no conditions beyond what's already in that contract you signed. But I wanted you to have this in front of your whole town so nobody ever has reason to doubt where that equipment came from or why. Gary took the framed document with trembling hands, staring down at it, his throat working silently as he tried to find words. 20 years, Gary finally managed, his voice cracking. 20 years I told myself I just needed one good break. One chance, my nuck. He looked up first at Hawk, then at Ryan, his eyes glistening. Turns out the break I needed was hiring a kid who cared more about everybody else than himself. Laughter rippled through the crowd, warm and relieved, breaking some of the tension that had built over the past several minutes. Ryan felt his own eyes stinging as he watched Gary's composure finally crack, the older man wiping roughly at his face with the back of his hand. But Hawk wasn't finished. There's one more thing, he said, and something in his tone made Ryan's stomach tighten with sudden uncertainty. Ryan, come up here. Ryan hesitated, glancing at his father, who gave him a small, encouraging nod, and reluctantly he made his way through the parting crowd toward the center of the street, his heart hammering with every step. I told you a few weeks back, Hawk said quietly, just for Ryan, though his voice still carried in the hushed street, that I had something bigger coming, something that would take time to wrap your head around. The foundation, Ryan said. The foundation, Hawk confirmed, nodding. He turned back to the crowd, raising his voice again. This young man agreed to help me build something in my son Michael's memory. A fund to help families in this state who are going through what my family went through, what Ryan's own family went through after his father's accident. Sudden loss. Medical bills that spiral out of control faster than anybody can keep up with. Kids forced to grow up faster than they should because life didn't give them a choice. He reached into his jacket, pulling out another folded document, holding it up for the crowd to see, before turning to Ryan. The Michael Donovan Foundation, of Hawk said, officially registered as of this week. Fully funded, fully legal, fully transparent, exactly the way I promised you it would be. His eyes locked onto Ryan's, fierce with emotion he no longer bothered hiding. And its first act before we've even opened applications to the public is this. He handed the folded document to Ryan, who opened it with unsteady hands, scanning the words slowly as their meaning settled over him. It was a full scholarship, not just for the remainder of his engineering certification, but a complete 4-year program at the State University, room board, tuition. Everything covered alongside a formal offer naming him founding director of the Michael Donovan Foundation upon completion. Ryan's hands began to shake, the paper trembling visibly, and when he looked up at Hawk, he found the older man's eyes wet, unashamed, watching him with an expression that carried more warmth than Ryan had ever seen directed at him from anyone outside his own family. I can't accept this. Ryan started, the old instinct rising automatically. This is too much, Hawk. You already gave me my life back, Hawk cut in, his voice rough. You already gave Gary his company back. You already stood up in a courtroom and told the truth when a dangerous man tried to scare you into silence. He gripped Ryan's shoulder firmly. Let somebody give something back to you for once. Not because you asked for it. Because you earned it 100 times over and had never once tried to collect. The crowd had gone completely silent, now watching the exchange with rapt attention. And somewhere near the front, Ryan heard his father's voice thick with emotion, unable to fully contain himself. "Take it, son." Ryan looked out at the crowd, at his father, tears streaming freely down his weathered face. At Gary, still clutching the framed contract to his chest. At Mrs. Halloway and Danny Ruiz and dozens of other faces he recognized from years of quiet, unnoticed kindness scattered across this small town. And something in his chest finally broke open the years of careful, deliberate invisibility, giving way to something he could no longer hold back. "Okay," Ryan said, voice cracking. "Okay, I'll take it." The crowd erupted into applause, and behind them, as if on cue, hundreds of motorcycle engines roared to life simultaneously. Not a threat, not intimidation, but something that sounded in that moment unmistakably like celebration. The sound rolled across the valley in waves echoing off the surrounding hills, and Ryan stood in the center of it all. Overwhelmed, his father's hand finding his own again, Gary's arm wrapping around his shoulders. Hawk standing beside him with a hand still resting firmly on his back. It was, Ryan would think later, the loudest silence had ever been broken in that small Montana town. The celebration stretched well into the afternoon, the street closing off to traffic as impromptu tables appeared. Local restaurants donating food, residents mingling cautiously at first. And then, with growing warmth among the bikers who had only hours earlier seemed like an intimidating unknown, rolling into their community. Ryan found himself pulled in a dozen directions at once. Reporters he now spoke to freely, neighbors shaking his hand, Trevor clapping him on the back so hard he nearly stumbled, laughing the whole time about how he'd called it. Hadn't he said Ryan was going to end up famous? "I didn't want to be famous," Ryan told Hissima, though he was smiling now, something looser and lighter in his chest than he'd felt in years. "Don't matter what you wanted, man," Trevor said, grinning. "Sometimes the world just decides for you." Amid the celebration, Ryan found a quiet moment to pull his father aside, wheeling him slightly apart from the crowd toward the shade of an old oak tree at the edge of the street. "You okay?" Ryan asked, crouching down to his father's level. Daniel's eyes were still wet, but his smile was wide, unguarded in a way Ryan hadn't seen in years. "I'm better than okay, son. I'm watching everything I ever hoped for you come true right in front of my own eyes." He reached out, cupping Ryan's face in his weathered hands. "Your mother would be so proud of you. I hope you know that." "I think about her a lot," Ryan admitted quietly. "Especially lately. Everything Hawk said about her, about doing the right thing, even when it's scary, that's exactly what she used to tell me." "She'd have loved this town, seeing what I've always known," Daniel said, "that you're the finest thing either of us ever helped put into this world." Ryan felt his throat tighten, and he pulled his father into a careful hug, mindful of the wheelchair, holding him close for a long moment, while the celebration continued around them, distant and warm. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin and the sun dipped low over the valley, painting the sky in deep golden orange, Ryan found himself standing beside Hawk near the edge of the gathering, both of them quiet, watching the last of the light fade. "You gonna be all right?" Hawk asked. "All this attention, all this change coming at you at once." "I don't know," Ryan admitted honestly. "It's a lot, but I think I'll figure it out. I usually do." Hawk chuckled softly, a low, warm sound. "Yeah, I've noticed that about you." He was quiet for a moment, studying the horizon. "You know what Michael would have thought of all this of you?" Ryan didn't answer, sensing Hawk needed the moment to continue on his own. "He would have liked you," Hawk finally said. "He was like you in a lot of ways. Kind, stubborn about doing the right thing, even when it cost him something. Used to give away his lunch money to kids who didn't have any, and I never even knew about it till his mother told me years later after he was already gone." Hawk's voice grew soft, wistful. "I like to think somehow, some way, he'd be proud that his name's attached to something that's going to help kids just like him. Kids who deserve a chance the world doesn't always give them. I'll make sure the foundation does right by his memory," Ryan said. "I promise you that." Hawk turned to look at him, something profoundly grateful passing across his weathered face. "I know you will, son. That's exactly why I trusted you with it in the first place." They stood together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, the crowd behind them slowly dispersing, motorcycles beginning to pull away in small groups, engines rumbling softly into the growing darkness. Curtis Boyle's sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later, and this time Ryan attended not as a nervous witness, but as a settled, steady presence beside his father, and Hawk watching as the judge handed down a sentence that reflected the full weight of what had been proven in court 12 years with the hate crime enhancement, ensuring Boyle would serve the vast majority of that time before any possibility of parole. Justice, Hawk said quietly as they left the courthouse for the final time, doesn't undo what's already happened. It never brings back what's already went on. He glanced at Ryan. But it matters anyway. It matters that the next person doesn't get hurt the same way. It matters that hatred has consequences, even in small towns where people think nobody's watching closely enough to notice. Life in the months that followed settled into a new rhythm for Ryan, one that still contained the familiar rhythms of hard work and quiet responsibility, but now expanded to hold something larger than he'd ever imagined for himself. He enrolled in the university program that fall, balancing coursework with continued part-time work at Fenn Construction, Gary insisting he stay on in whatever capacity fit around his studies, unwilling to fully let go of the young man who'd become as much a partner in the company's growth as an employee. You'll always have a place here, Gary told him. Foundation or no foundation, degree or no degree. This company doesn't exist without what you did, and I don't forget things like that. The Michael Donovan Foundation opened its doors to applications that same fall, and within the first month, Ryan found himself reviewing case after case that struck painfully close to home: families drowning under medical debt after sudden accidents, children forced into premature responsibility when a parent's injury upended everything, situations that mirrored his own family's struggle so closely that some nights he had to step away from his desk entirely overwhelmed by the weight of it. But alongside that weight came something else, the profound satisfaction of watching relief actually arrive for families who'd stopped believing help was possible. The first family the foundation assisted was a single mother in a neighboring county whose husband had been killed in a workplace accident eerily similar to Daniel's, leaving her with 3 children and a mountain of bills that had begun threatening to take the family home. Ryan drove out personally to deliver the news, and when the woman opened the door and he explained who he was and what the foundation could offer, she broke down completely on her own front porch, unable to form words for several long minutes. I don't understand, she finally managed. Why us? Why now? Because somebody once gave my family a chance we didn't think we'd get, Ryan told her gently. And I promised the man who started this foundation that I'd make sure that chance kept getting passed forward. Driving home that evening, Ryan called Hawk, his voice still thick with emotion, as he described the woman's reaction, the way her children had come running out when they realized what was happening, the disbelief slowly transforming into something like hope right in front of him. That's it, Hawk said quietly once Ryan finished. That's exactly it, son. That's what this was always supposed to be. Winter came and went, and by the time spring arrived, the foundation had assisted 11 families across the state, each story different in its details, but united by the same thread: sudden loss, overwhelming circumstance, and a chance to breathe again that hadn't existed before. Hawk's leg had fully healed by then, though he still favored it slightly on cold mornings, a permanent reminder of the day that had set everything in motion. He and Ryan had settled into something that neither of them had quite expected, but both had come to treasure, not quite mentor and mentee, not quite something as simple as friendship, but a bond forged in gratitude and grief, and the shared understanding of what it meant to choose courage when the easier path was simply to look away. They met for coffee most weeks now at the same Copper Kettle Diner, where their story had truly begun, and it was during one of these quiet mornings, nearly a year after the accident on Route 12, that Hawk finally said the words that would stay with Ryan for the rest of his life. I've been thinking a lot lately, Hawk said, stirring his coffee slowly, about the kind of man you turned out to be. Ryan smiled faintly. Should I be worried? No. Hawk shook his head, his expression growing serious, contemplative. I've watched a lot of people in my life, Ryan. Watched who they were when nobody was looking and who they pretended to be when the cameras came on. His eyes met Ryan's steadily. Most people become good because somebody's watching, because there's a reward waiting or a reputation to protect or consequences to avoid if they don't. It's rare, genuinely rare, to find somebody who was already good long before anybody knew their name. Ryan felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rising in his cheeks, the old instinct to deflect praise still alive and well, even after everything that had happened. I just try to do what's right. That's exactly my point, Hawk said, a faint knowing smile touching his weathered face. You say that like it is simple. Like everybody does that. But they don't, son. Almost nobody does that, not consistently, not when nobody's around to notice. He leaned forward slightly. You fixed that widow's roof 2 years before any of this happened, and you never told a soul about it. You paid for that veteran's groceries and disappeared before he could even thank you. You asked for equipment for your boss before you'd let yourself accept a single dollar for your own future. His voice grew quieter, more solemn. You were good long before anyone knew your name, Ryan. That's the truest thing I know about you. Ryan sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling into his chest, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty that surprised even himself. Doing the right thing shouldn't depend on who's looking, Ryan said simply. That's what my mom always told me. I guess it just stuck. Hawk nodded slowly, something profoundly moved passing across his face. It's stuck, all right. Stuck in a way that's changed a whole lot more than just my life. They sat together in comfortable silence. After that, the diner quiet around them. The same waitress who'd served them coffee on that very first meeting, now smiling warmly from behind the counter, recognizing them both as regulars, now part of the rhythm of this small, unremarkable place that had somehow become the setting for something far larger than either of them could have anticipated that scorching summer afternoon. Ryan continued his studies through that year and into the next, graduating, eventually with the engineering certification that had once felt impossibly out of reach, walking across a stage in a cap and gown, while his father watched from the front row, tears streaming freely down his face, no longer even trying to hide them. Gary sat beside him, having closed the construction site early that day specifically to attend, and behind them in a section reserved specifically for the occasion, sat nearly 30 members of the Hells Angels, including Hawk himself, all of them cheering loud enough to draw curious glances from the rest of the graduating class's families. Ryan Walker, the dean announced, and as Ryan crossed the stage to accept his diploma, he caught sight of his father's face in the crowd, pride and love, and years of quiet sacrifice all visible at once, etched into every line of his weathered features. And he felt in that single moment that everything the past 2 years had cost him in exhaustion and uncertainty had been worth every second of it. Fenn Construction, by that point, had grown into the largest employer in the county, outside of the school district itself. Gary's decades of patient, honest business practice finally given the resources to flourish the way he had always dreamed it could. Ryan stepped fully into his role as operations director shortly after graduation, bringing his engineering knowledge to bear on projects that continued expanding across the region, creating jobs, building infrastructure, and steadily transforming the small town that had once seemed destined to slowly fade the way so many rural communities had before it. The Michael Donovan Foundation, meanwhile, had grown beyond anything Hawk or Ryan had initially imagined, expanding its reach across 3 states, assisting over 200 families by the foundation's 2nd anniversary, each case reviewed personally by Ryan himself, who insisted on maintaining that connection, even as the organization's administrative demands grew increasingly complex. You could hire somebody to handle the applications, Hawk told him once, watching Ryan pore over case files late into the evening at the foundation's small office. You don't have to read every single one yourself. I want to, Ryan said simply. Every family in these files reminds me why we started this. I don't ever want to lose sight of that. Hawk had simply that nodded, understanding completely, because he'd known from the very beginning, from that first meeting at the Copper Kettle Diner, watching a young man ask for equipment for his boss before considering a single thing for himself, that Ryan Walker was never going to be the kind of person who let success change the fundamental core of who he was. It was nearly 3 years after the accident on Route 12 when Hawk showed up unannounced at the Fenn Construction offices one afternoon, finding Ryan bent over blueprints for a new community center. The company had been contracted to build a project funded in part by continued partnership investments from the club's legitimate business interests, designed specifically to serve the town's growing population of young families and elderly residents alike. You got a minute? Hawk asked, leaning against the doorframe. Ryan looked up, smiling immediately at the sight of him. Always. What's going on? Hawk stepped inside, moving easily now. No trace of the limp that had once marked every step. He settled into the chair across from Ryan's desk, studying him for a long moment before speaking. I wanted to tell you something, Hawk said. Something I've been sitting with for a while now, and I finally figured out how to say it properly. Ryan set down his pen, giving Hawk his full attention. Okay. You remember what I told you back at my house the day I told you about Michael? Hawk asked. About how I'd spent 25 years believing the world was full of people who'd rather protect themselves than help a stranger. I remember. I don't believe that anymore, Hawk said simply. Not because the world changed, not because people suddenly got better. He leaned forward, his eyes steady, sincere. I don't believe it anymore because I watched you day after day, month after month, choose to be exactly the kind of person I'd stopped believing existed. Not because it was convenient, not because anybody was watching or rewarding you for it, just because it's who you are, but all the way down. Ryan felt his throat tighten, the familiar emotion rising even now, even after everything they'd been through together. You gave me my life back on that highway, Hawk continued, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered concealing. But what you gave me after that, Ryan, the proof that goodness isn't some rare accident, that it's a choice people can make every single day, if they decide it matters enough, that gave me something I thought I'd lost forever the night Michael died. You gave me my faith back. In people, in this world, in the idea that all the sacrifice, all the grief, all of it might actually mean something in the end. The office fell into a heavy, meaningful silence, both men sitting with the weight of everything that had unfolded since that scorching summer afternoon on Route 12. The fire, the rescue, the trial, the foundation, the slow, steady transformation of a small Montana town that had learned through one young man's quiet courage to look past assumptions and see people for who they actually were. Most people become good because someone is watching, Hawk said, finally, his voice carrying the same weight it had carried the very first time he'd said these words to Ryan months earlier, on the day the entire town had gathered to witness something none of them would ever forget. You were good long before anyone knew your name. Ryan met his eyes steady and certain, the same quiet conviction that had carried him through every choice since that day on the highway settling firmly into his voice as he answered. Doing the right thing shouldn't depend on who's looking. Outside the office window, the sound of construction continued. Steadily, hammers, machinery, the low hum of a town rebuilding itself into something stronger than it had been before. Brick by brick, contract by contract, family by family, lifted through a foundation born from grief and transformed into hope. Somewhere across 3 states, families who had once stared down impossible bills and impossible loss were sitting a little easier tonight, breathing a little freer, because 2 seconds on an empty highway had proven that courage still existed in a world that too often forgot to expect it. Ryan Walker never set out to become anybody's hero. He never wanted the cameras, the headlines, the attention that had followed him relentlessly since the day he sprinted into oncoming traffic without a single thought for his own safety. He simply refused in that single instant, and in every instant since, to let another human being suffer when he had the power to do something about it. And in the end, that was the whole story, not a tale of extraordinary circumstance, but of ordinary decency chosen again and again in a world that had nearly forgotten it was possible. Real heroes don't wait to be recognized. They simply act, and the world sooner or later always finds a way to notice.